Michael Reese was born in a small town in Alabama on December 15, 1980s. He was the eldest of 3 children in the family, and from an early age his parents raised him to be responsible and hardworking. His father, a former military man, always emphasized the importance of discipline, and his mother, a homemaker, taught her children to value family bonds and support each other. Michael was characterized by a calm and confident character. As a teenager, he was already known among his peers as someone who could be relied on, a guy with iron discipline and a drive to succeed. Michael graduated from high school with honors. He was one of the top students in his class, passionate about math and physics, and always eager to learn. His outstanding academic performance led him to receive a scholarship and attend the University of Alabama to study engineering. From the beginning of his studies, Michael proved himself to be a diligent student, always willing to help his classmates and participate in various university projects. His charisma and leadership skills made him popular in academic circles, and soon Michael became one of the most respected students in the department. At the university, Michael met Cindy K. Henderson. It happened at one of the student meetings when Cindy, being a young and ambitious student, approached Michael with a question about an upcoming research paper. She immediately caught his attention. Her friendliness and sincerity struck Michael. He wasn't ready for this kind of relationship, but with each day he spent with her, he became more and more enamored. Cindy was a woman who always knew how to find common ground with those around her, and her kind eyes and attention to detail couldn't help but draw Michael in. Their conversations grew longer and longer, and soon both realized that there was more than just friendship between them. Their relationship developed quickly. Michael, who had always adhered to the principles of rationality and logic, fell in love with Cindy almost without a second thought. She was for him like air, filling his life with new meanings. In 2003, after several years of studying and socializing together, Michael and Cindy decided to get married. This moment became for them a logical continuation of the relationship that they had built from the beginning, on trust and respect. The wedding was held in a small circle of friends and family, and everyone noticed how happy they were together. Cindy wore a classic wedding dress, and Michael looked serious and responsible as always. The celebration was full of laughter, fun, but also deep conversations about the future. The newlyweds set ambitious goals for themselves: to build a career, have children, and create a home filled with happiness. Immediately after their wedding, Michael and Cindy moved into a home in Morris, a small town in Alabama, where Michael took a job with an engineering company. Cindy soon found work as well, beginning her career at the local library. Life seemed quite ordinary and stable. Their relationship continued to grow, and the couple was seen as an example of the perfect married couple. Michael had everything he could have dreamed of: a stable job, a loving wife, and a home of his own. He was content with his life and could only hope for further happiness with Cindy. On February 18, 2015, as they did every Sunday, Michael and Cindy went to church. It was the highlight of the week for them, a time for fellowship with friends, reflection, and prayer. After the service, they returned home, and as usual, the house was quiet and orderly. Cindy decided to go to the store to do some shopping, and Michael, apparently determined to get some rest, went to his room. A short while later, after returning from shopping, Cindy found herself in a house that looked like the aftermath of a break-in. Furniture was overturned and belongings were strewn across the floor, making it look like someone had ransacked the house. It was uncharacteristic of her home, and Cindy's heart beat faster. As she headed into the bedroom to check what was going on, her gaze stopped on a motionless figure on the floor. It was her husband, Michael. Cindy froze for a moment, not realizing what had happened. Then, as quickly as possible, she grabbed her cell phone and dialed the emergency number. She began to panic, reporting that the house had been burglarized and her husband had been murdered. With each word, her voice became more and more anxious, and she struggled to calm herself as she tried to explain what was happening. Her first reaction was one of shock, fear, and bewilderment, but nevertheless she reported what had happened, then sat waiting for help. When police arrived on the scene, the Reese home in Morris, Alabama was already engulfed in an unsettling silence. The residential neighborhood where the house was located was usually quiet, with well-kept yards and friendly neighbors. But that night, the atmosphere here was different. The police who arrived on the call soon realized that this time they were facing an investigation that could completely change the usual course of life of the locals for the near future. The house was quite spacious, 2 stories high with large windows through which a lot of light penetrated during the daytime. It was cozy and seemed perfectly suited for family life. Inside, however, things were not as expected. The police soon discovered several disturbing details that raised questions and wariness. A place that should have been a home full of warmth and security was now filled with a sense of unease. When the police officers entered the house, they immediately noticed that the furnishings were strangely disturbed. The room where the furniture usually stood was turned upside down. Chairs, couches, and armchairs were all out of place. Police noted that this was not typical of a burglary case, as valuables and money in the house had not been touched. There were no broken doors or windows, which usually accompanies burglaries with entry. This gave the impression that the house had not just been searched, but prepared to create the illusion of a break-in. In one of the rooms near the staircase, there was scattered trash. Photographs, books, some personal items, but again, nothing of value was missing. Police noticed that most of the rooms in the house looked like someone had tried to create the illusion of chaos by knocking over items and scattering things. However, some details, such as neatly stacked books or papers left on a table, seemed atypical of a situation where someone was willing to search the house for valuable property. These elements were puzzling to detectives because they raised suspicions that someone had tried to create a crime scene that seemed natural. Michael Reese was found in a second-floor bedroom not far from his bed. His body was lying on the floor, motionless, and looked as if he had fallen after being shot. He was found face down, which also caught the investigators' attention. Signs of a struggle were evident. The bed and nightstands had been moved, and there were things lying on the floor that seemed to confirm his attempts to resist or escape. What was most surprising, however, was that, despite the devastation in the room, there were no visible signs of a struggle on his body, no scratches, no signs of damage from blows. This seemed like a contradiction, for at first glance the scene resembled a wrestling scene. Police also noticed the strange position of the body. Michael Reese was found with a small blood stain on the back of his head, indicating that he had been shot in the back. Footprints on the floor leading away from his body did not confirm the standard struggle pattern, but indicated that the victim was likely caught off guard. The bullets used in the murder found no marks on the furniture, indicating a very accurate shot. Neighbors were interviewed immediately after police established the surroundings of the house. Several of them reported hearing strange noises hours before Cindy called the police. One neighbor claimed she saw Michael and Cindy coming home from church, and they looked calm and happy as always. No one reported any arguments or conflicts between the couple, which was also an important point for the investigation. Other neighbors claimed to have noticed strange activity in the area around 4 p.m., at which time, according to them, an unknown man was watching the house while standing at the gate. However, no one could say for sure who it was, as the man quickly left without making contact with the neighbors. This observation raised new questions for investigators because if someone was watching the house, it could have been part of a more complex plan than just a random burglary. Cindy Reese was interviewed immediately after police were called to the house. She in turn provided a brief version of events, explaining that she came home after shopping and found the mess and her husband lying on the floor. She stated that she immediately called the police without waiting for anything else to happen. However, investigators began asking her more questions to find out details and noticed that her answers were a little imprecise. She was often nervous when answering questions about exactly when she got home and when she noticed the mess in the house. Neighbors, for their part, reported that they saw no signs that anyone had been fighting with them or was on bad terms with Michael. After the police completed their initial survey of the crime scene, the work of gathering evidence and establishing all the details of the incident began. At that point, there was no clear evidence of who could be responsible for Michael Reese's death, but the initial steps of the investigation began to reveal circumstances that brought to light several key aspects in the behavior of those involved in the case. Initial investigations began by interviewing Cindy Reese, as she was the first person to discover her husband's body. Cindy provided police officers with a version of events that when she returned home after shopping, she found the house upside down and her husband lying dead on the floor. There were no apparent contradictions in her story. However, investigators immediately noticed that her demeanor was somewhat nervous and not entirely appropriate to the situation. Cindy was quick to respond to questions, but her answers did not always match what the police expected to see or hear. For example, she could not remember exactly what she had been doing between the time she returned home and the time she discovered her husband's body. At times, she said she was acting normal, but her manner of answering questions and nervous demeanor raised questions with investigators. In addition, an important point was that there were no signs in the house that a real struggle had taken place. Michael was found in his bedroom, but there were no signs of a struggle, such as scratches, injuries on his body. All of this indicated that Michael may have been killed in a surprise attack, perhaps at a time when he was not prepared. Another important part of the investigation was the investigators' attempts to understand how things were in the Reese household. Neighbors and close friends saw no overt signs that the relationship between Michael and Cindy was strained or problematic. On the contrary, everyone spoke of the family as exemplary, which created a sense of normalcy and calm in their marriage. However, once the police began to delve into the couple's personal lives, some details came to light that made them pay attention to the relationships within the family. Among such points was that Cindy and Michael seemed somewhat distant from each other for the past few months. Neighbors noted that in the last weeks before the murder, Cindy had been spending more time out of the house, while Michael, in turn, had been seen in strange moods, although he did not reveal the reason for his indisposition. In addition, reports began to surface that Michael had mentioned several times in conversation with friends that he was worried about his wife and her strange behavior. He even expressed concern that she might have started a relationship with someone else, indicating possible problems in their marriage that were not visible to those around them. One of the key points in the investigation became related to the testimony of neighbors. One of them reported that about a week before the murder, he had noticed an unfamiliar man who frequently entered the Reese's home and entered the area around their house. This man was seen in the shadows of the house, watching the house for several days. The neighbor claimed that this was not any of the usual guests or relatives he had seen before, and he noticed his strange behavior. The neighbor, although he could not accurately identify the man, noted that he had seen the man a few days before the murder standing at the gate and had also noticed him several times as if he was checking to see if anyone was approaching the house. Police officers began checking out all possible people who could be connected to such sightings. This further increased investigators' suspicions that not everything was so obvious and that there was something more than a random burglary. One of the most important aspects of the investigation was the attention paid to the crime scene itself. Police began analyzing what had been done to the house after the murder. Destroyed furnishings and overturned furniture clearly indicated an attempted robbery. However, upon closer inspection, investigators noticed that the destruction had a more artificial look to it, as if the intruder was not trying to search for expensive items, but rather trying to wreak havoc indoors. This led investigators to believe that the killer may have known how to create scenes that could distract attention from the real motives behind the murder. In the process, it was clear that the actions at the crime scene were part of an elaborate strategy to hide the true motives. These moments encouraged the idea that Cindy, as the wife, may have been involved in the planning of the crime. The investigation, which lasted weeks, gradually began to piece together a picture that was far more complex than investigators had originally envisioned. The police officers working on the Michael Reese case understood. The simple explanation, a robbery with a tragic outcome, didn't hold up. The house had not been broken into, valuables were still in place, and the nature of the damage to the house looked more and more like staging. All of this required not a superficial analysis, but a painstaking examination of every detail. One of the first reasons to doubt the official version was to analyze the timeline of events. According to Cindy's testimony, she went to the supermarket after she and Michael returned from church service and was gone for about an hour. However, a check of the store's surveillance cameras, where she claimed to have been, revealed that her visit lasted less than 20 minutes. In addition, the time listed on the cash register receipt did not match the time Cindy gave during her initial interview. Investigators carefully reconstructed her route that day, using traffic camera data and GPS tracking from her cell phone. It turned out that between the end of the service and arriving at the store, Cindy had about 40 minutes unexplained by her version of events. These empty minutes caused investigators concern and were subject to additional scrutiny. When Cindy was invited for a second interview, she tried to remain calm, but her demeanor changed. Her answers became less confident, and her tone became noticeably tense. As she tried to reconstruct the sequence of her actions on the day of the incident, Cindy began to confuse the details. She claimed to have heard a noise when she entered the house, or she said she went to the kitchen first and then noticed the mess. Investigators were also interested in Cindy's phone contacts over the past months. Analysis of calls and messages revealed a certain pattern: regular correspondence with a man named Jeffrey. At first, he was passed off as a stranger, but the deeper the investigators dug, the clearer his connection to Cindy became. Pastor Jeffrey David Brown was the minister of the very church that Cindy and Michael went to every Sunday. He was respected in the congregation, had charm, eloquence, and always had a way with people. No one would associate his name with anything illegal. However, a closer examination of his relationship with Cindy revealed that there had already been a close personal relationship between them for months, which neither Michael nor the church congregation knew about. Cindy Reese had met Pastor Jeffrey Brown at the church where she and her husband Michael regularly attended on Sundays. He was a new minister in the congregation, charismatic, confident, and attentive to the congregation. Their fellowship began with short conversations after the service, discussing sermons, asking for prayer support, and giving advice on spiritual literature. Over time, these conversations became more and more personal. The pastor, with his keen psychological intuition, quickly gained Cindy's trust. He was interested in her inner feelings, asking about her family and marriage. She found in these conversations sympathy and attention, which she said she lacked in her daily life. Gradually, the meetings went beyond the church walls. They began to see each other more often, first as part of spiritual counseling, then in settings where the religious context was replaced by personal affection. From correspondence recovered with the help of digital data experts, investigators learned that Cindy and Jeffrey were engaged in covert correspondence. Messages containing personal confessions, discussions about the future, and ambiguous phrases that could indicate a desire to be together without unnecessary obstacles. Some of these messages dated back to weeks before Michael's death and clearly showed emotional closeness between the two. Several witnesses, parishioners, and church staff later reported noticing Cindy and the pastor lingering after services and sometimes leaving together, explaining it was church work issues. No one had perceived this as anything suspicious, but now in light of the new data, these little things took on a different meaning. The next wave of the investigation focused on the physical evidence. Additional forensic tests were conducted. One of these was a ballistics study, which showed that the shot was fired from a weapon close to the victim, accurately aimed at the back of the head. A typical sign, experts pointed out, of a control shot, rather than a random or hasty act during a theft. Forensic experts also noted that Michael probably wasn't expecting an attack. He had no defensive wounds or signs of resistance. This also meant that he trusted whoever happened to be around at the time. This conclusion indirectly confirmed that the crime was not committed by a stranger, but by someone close to him. It turned out that the evening before the tragedy, between them had a long telephone conversation lasting almost 40 minutes. And a few hours after the discovery of the body, when the police were already working at the scene, from her phone were sent 2 short messages to Brown's number. Their content was partially recovered. One contained the phrase, "Everything is as we said it would be," and the other, "It's up to me now." During the interrogation, conducted a few days after the discovery of new evidence, the pastor initially denied any personal relationship with Cindy, but under the pressure of the facts presented to him, messages, call times, witness testimony, was forced to admit that there was indeed an intimate relationship between them. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Michael's death. But this admission alone was a major factor in the investigation. The investigation culminated when police seized Cindy's laptop, on which they found deleted correspondence recovered by forensic experts. It contained messages written a week before the incident, where she and Brown discussed a new life, freedom, and having to make a tough decision. In fact, Cindy Reese's outwardly peaceful and pious life hid a closely guarded secret. In the months leading up to the tragedy, she led a double life. On the one hand, a caring wife, an active churchgoer, a loving spouse who returned from shopping to a house full of chaos. On the other was a woman infatuated with the pastor of their local church, Jeffrey Brown, with whom she had not just feelings, but a shared plan for a future that had no place for Michael. The evidence released revealed that the murder was not the result of a sudden conflict or accident, but a premeditated act. That evening, February 18, 2015, after returning from a church service, Cindy, taking advantage of the moment when the two of them were alone at home, approached Michael from behind and shot him in the back of the head. It was a single, fatal shot, accurate and decisive. She then left the house, headed to the grocery store, saving the receipt and thus forming an alibi for herself. When she returned, Cindy purposefully turned over furniture, scattered personal belongings, opened drawers, making it look like a chaotic robbery. It was all designed to mislead the police. She called 911, feigning panic and fear, but the motive became obvious when her relationship with Brown was revealed. The hundreds of texts, the late-night calls, the discussions about a future without Michael. She wanted to start a new life, and it seemed the only obstacle in the way was her husband. This criminal affair was the catalyst for tragedy, destroying not just one family, but the trust of an entire community. This and other evidence gathered over the course of a month and a half allowed the police to form a reasonable enough opinion to apprehend both Cindy Reese and Pastor Jeffrey Brown. Both were taken into custody. They were read their rights, and at this point the case moved into the next, judicial phase, where all the evidence obtained had to receive its legal assessment. The Michael Reese murder trial began in early January 2017 in the Circuit Court of Jefferson County, Alabama. The case aroused considerable public interest. The hall was full of not only relatives, but also journalists, representatives of the local press, and ordinary residents who were not indifferent to what was happening. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. The story seemed unbelievable. A wife, a respected member of the church community, was accused of murdering her own husband, and her alleged accomplice was a pastor, a spiritual leader and a symbol of moral authority. The prosecution presented a carefully assembled evidentiary case. The results of ballistics analysis, testimony of criminalists, recovered correspondence, and records of phone calls between Cindy Reese and Pastor Jeffrey Brown were provided. The prosecution laid out a logical chain: the presence of motive, the possibility of a crime, the attempted cover-up, and the fake robbery scene created. Particular attention of the jury was drawn to the messages in which Cindy and Brown discussed a new life and the need for change, indicating a pre-formulated intent to eliminate Michael. The defense, on the other hand, insisted that there was no direct evidence of guilt. They argued that none of the evidence proved Cindy's involvement in the murder directly, and the entire evidentiary base was built on circumstantial evidence. It was suggested that the murder could have been the work of a third party and that the relationship between Cindy and Brown was merely a moral lapse, but not the basis for a murder conviction. However, it wasn't just the evidence that played against Cindy, but also the demeanor. Jurors paid attention to inconsistencies in her testimony, the way her version of events changed, and details she omitted or avoided discussing. Also impressive were the presentations by the investigators and forensic experts, who clearly and consistently explained why the robbery version did not hold up. As for Pastor Jeffrey Brown, he did not stand trial as a co-defendant. In exchange for a full plea of guilty to manslaughter and testifying against Cindy Reese, he made a deal with prosecutors. This allowed him to avoid a life sentence and played an important role in the trial. On January 11, 2017, the Jefferson County Circuit Court found Cindy K. Henderson Reese guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Nahir Galarza was born on September 11, 1998 in Argentina. Her childhood was spent in a family where discipline and order came first. Her father, Marcelo Galarza, served in the police force. Her mother, Ivite Villalba, took care of the house. Nahir grew up an obedient child, tried not to cause problems to her parents, did well in school, and from childhood dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Her beauty and self-confidence attracted attention, and on social media she seemed happy and carefree. After high school, she went to university to study law. Her parents were sure that their daughter would have a successful future, but behind the perfect picture there were doubts, fears, and insecurities. Fernando Pastorizo was born on August 25, 1997. Unlike Nahir, his family was not so prosperous. His parents divorced when he was young, and although he kept in contact with both, his upbringing was mostly handled by his mother, Silvia Mantegazza. She worked to support her son and tried to give him everything he needed. Fernando was an ordinary boy, not an excellent student, but not a bully either. He loved motorcycles, often rode through the streets of the city, and dreamed of freedom. Unlike Nahir, he did not go to university, but tried to find himself in life, worked part-time, and did not make long-term plans. They met when Nahir was 15 and Fernando was 16. They lived in the same city and their families knew each other, but first really got to know each other through mutual friends. At first they just texted each other, exchanging jokes, discussing music and movies. Fernando was attentive and caring, and Nahir liked his charm. Their friendship quickly grew into something more. Their relationship was not easy. They often broke up and got back together again. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they didn't speak for weeks. But they always came back to each other. It was a typical teenage romance, stormy, passionate, but not always stable. The last year of their relationship was particularly difficult. They argued more often than before, began to hide their feelings from each other. Fernando told his friends he was tired of the swinging, and Nahir became more and more withdrawn. The clock showed around midnight when Nahir Galarza dialed Fernando Pastorizo. Her voice was steady, but there was some tension in her words. She asked to meet. Fernando didn't argue. Perhaps he thought this was just a normal conversation, another reconciliation, another attempt to sort out their complicated relationship. Fernando rode up to her house on his moped. He looked calm in the dark, but perhaps deep down something told him. They rode through the deserted streets. The light of the street lamps cast long shadows on the asphalt. The city was asleep. There were no cars or passers-by. Only the rustle of tires on the road and the occasional barking of dogs broke the silence. They were talking. About what now no one will never know. Perhaps it was a conversation about the past, about the days when everything was simple and carefree. Or maybe they were talking about the future, which now seemed so uncertain. Or maybe it was a goodbye conversation, an attempt to close old wounds. And then the first shot rang out. A sharp pop broke the silence of the night. Fernando jerked forward. His body tensed, his fingers frantically gripped the handlebars of the motor. There was a second of silence. The bullet struck Fernando in the chest. He didn't move again. A man woke up in a nearby house. He thought he heard a strange sound. At first, he thought it was a firecracker, but something inside told him it was no ordinary pop. He got out of bed, went to the window, and froze. There was a guy lying on the dark road next to an overturned moped. For a few seconds, he just stared. Maybe it had been an accident? Maybe the young man had just passed out? But something was wrong. The man picked up his cell phone and dialed the emergency number. "I heard gunshots. There's a guy here. He's not moving." As he spoke to the operator, the street remained empty. Sirens cut through the silence of the nighttime city, breaking the darkness with flashing lights. An ambulance was the first to arrive. The car door creaked open and two paramedics swiftly emerged. They walked toward the body, treading carefully on the damp asphalt, careful not to step on the footprints scattered around them. One of them bent down, checked the pulse on the young man's neck, then looked at the other and nodded briefly. There was no life in him. The second medic exhaled quietly and looked at the moped piled on its side next to the body, then shifted his gaze to the bloodstain spreading across the road. It was obvious. The guy had died instantly. There was no attempt to call for help, no struggle, no agony, 2 precise shots, both fatal. While the paramedics were recording the time of death, the police arrived on the scene. Several officers stepped out of the car. Ahead of them walked Detective Alberto Morales, a man with a cold stare and measured movements. He took a quick glance around the scene, noting the key details: the body, the moped, the pool of blood that had begun to slowly drip toward the curb. Looking up, he noticed that the street was empty. The windows of the nearest houses were dark, which meant that either the occupants were fast asleep or no one wanted to interfere. He moved closer and looked at the young man lying on the ground. The body was motionless. The skin was already starting to pale. There were 2 gunshots visible on the body. If this was a robbery, the shots would have been different. What if it was someone who knew the victim? He shifted his gaze to his men and said briefly, "We need to check the pockets." The officers began the search. In the jacket pocket they found a cell phone, some cash, keys, no wallet, no ID, no weapon. The detective frowned. If this had been a robbery, the perpetrator would probably have taken something of value, but the cell phone was still there. So this wasn't a random street raid. Then what is it? He lifted his head and looked to the end of the street. No witnesses. The officers continued their inspection. One of them picked up the moped, examined its body, checked the glove compartment, but it was empty. The gas tank was half full and the keys were still in the ignition. The detective ran his fingers along the steering wheel and noticed that the victim's arms had weakened abruptly before falling, with no attempt to hold on. So the first shot occurred while the guy was still on the moped. Morales looked closely at the position of the body. The second one was probably fired after the fall, the kill shot. He straightened up and looked around. Murder weapon? No, not in the bushes, not near the bike, not within sight. So it had either been taken with him or thrown away. He called in one of the officers. "Bring up the ballistics team, have them survey the area." The officer nodded and stepped back to make the call. While the police secured the crime scene, the detective made his first theories. Robbery ruled out. That left either a contract killing or a personal hate crime. He looked at the moped. If the perpetrator wanted to hide his motives, he could have taken the bike or at least some of his personal belongings to give the impression of an attack. But everything's still there. Then it wasn't a robbery. He took another look at the body. Someone wanted to make sure the guy was dead. Someone had fired without hesitation. He crouched down next to the body and looked at the dead man's face. His eyes were open, his frozen gaze staring upward. He didn't realize what had happened in the first few seconds. Perhaps he hadn't even had time to be frightened. The detective stood up and turned to his men. "We need to find out who he is. Pull up his ID. Find family, friends, Morales glanced around the street again. He didn't like this place. Quiet, empty, deserted. If the killer wanted to avoid witnesses, he'd picked the right time. But then why here? Why not somewhere else? The detective wondered. Perhaps this place had significance. Either the victim had been brought here on purpose, or he had come on his own. In either case, the killer knew what he was doing. The ballistics car pulled up quickly. 3 specialists got out, one of whom was already putting on gloves in preparation for work. They nodded silently to the detective and immediately began their examination. After a couple minutes, one of them turned to Morales. 2 shots. I can't determine the caliber yet, but judging by the nature of the wounds, the weapon was compact, probably a pistol. Short range, the killer was very close. The detective nodded. That meant it wasn't fired from cover or from afar. The attack wasn't sudden, it was planned. While ballistics continued their work, the officers checked the nearby houses. Most of the residents were already asleep, but there were some who heard sounds. One man said he thought he heard firecrackers going off, but when he looked out the window, all he saw was a motorcycle and a guy lying on the ground. There was no one else around. The detective looked at the crime scene again. It looked like the killer had vanished into the night. But it doesn't work that way. There are always traces left behind. Morales took a deep breath. Now it was up to him to figure out who might have wanted the young man dead. He glanced at the dead man's cell phone, which one of the officers was holding. Text messages, calls, recent contacts, all of it could provide clues. Time to reach out to family and friends. Time to figure out who this guy was and who he might have been bothering. The investigation was gaining momentum, but so far the police hadn't found any obvious motive for the murder. They started with the simplest of tasks, interviewing Fernando Pastorizo's family and friends. If the crime was related to personal animosity or revenge, it could be reflected in his environment, behavior in recent days, possible conflicts or strained relationships. The first people questioned were the parents of the deceased. Silvia Mantagazza, his mother, met the investigators in a state of deep sorrow, but firmly stated that her son was not associated with criminal groups, was not involved in illegal activities, and had no enemies who might want him dead. She reiterated that Fernando was an ordinary young man who liked to ride his moped, go out with friends and spend time with his girlfriend. Fernando's father, Gustavo Pastorizo, confirmed these words, adding that his son had never been in serious trouble. The parents did not believe the murder could have been criminally related. The police then approached the friends of the deceased. None of them could say anything that would indicate a possible motive for the crime. They all said the same thing. Fernando was a good guy, calm, non-confrontational, but in recent months he had seemed really tense. Some recalled that he avoided talking about his relationship and tried not to touch the subject if anyone brought it up. However, it didn't seem like something threatening. More like the usual problems in his personal life that many young people go through. The police analyzed the financial transactions of the deceased, checked his activity in social networks, but found nothing suspicious. He did not own large sums of money, had no debts or unexpected expenses. All his movements and contacts looked normal. The theory that he might have been killed because of debts or criminal disputes became irrelevant. While the police were gathering information, the next morning the ballistic examination provided the first official results. Forensic experts determined that the murder was committed at close range. First shot to the back, second shot to the chest. This indicated that the attacker was close to the victim, and after the fall, Fernando fired a control shot. Both shots were fired from a 9mm caliber pistol. This caliber was common among gun owners, both civilians and police officers. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, which meant that the killer deliberately took it with him. This indicated that the perpetrator did not act on impulse, but had probably thought out a plan in advance. The police did not yet have a clear idea of who the attacker might have been. Soon, new information came in. In social networks, there was a message that attracted the attention of the investigation. In the afternoon, a few hours after the publication of the forensic data, social media activity came to the attention of the police. Nahir Galarza, Fernando's girlfriend, posted a photo of them together. This post was noticed not only by friends of the deceased but also by investigators. The photo was accompanied by a short comment, "I will love you always, my angel." The message aroused the interest of the police but did not become a basis for suspicion. Such postings in the wake of tragedies were not unusual. Many people losing loved ones shared their feelings on social media. However, the investigators recorded this fact as it could play a role in the future. At this stage of the investigation, Nahir was not considered a suspect. She was the girlfriend of the deceased and therefore one of the key witnesses. The police decided to gather more information about her. While checking her background, investigators found out that her father, Marcelo Galarza, was a police officer. His personnel file showed that he had a service weapon registered with the police. So far, it was just a coincidence, but the fact that the murder weapon matched a typical police pistol got the detective thinking. If the killer had used such a gun, it could mean two things. Either the perpetrator had access to an official gun, or the gun had been acquired illegally, making the search more difficult. At this point, the police could not build specific charges. However, there was a new lead in the case that needed to be followed up. The investigation continues. So far, the police had no clear idea which direction to take. The attacker had left no trace. No one had seen the moment of the murder, and Fernando himself was not connected to crime or anything that could lead to such a brutal massacre. Investigators had to figure out, was the murder carefully planned, or was it an outburst of emotion? Why didn't the perpetrator steal anything if it was an assault? And most importantly, who could have been so close to the victim to shoot twice and yet disappear without leaving a single piece of evidence behind? In the evening of the same day, while the police were still trying to reconstruct the picture of Fernando Pastorizo's murder, something happened that no one expected. Nahir Galarza came to the station. She looked calm but a little tense. She asked to see the investigators and said she wanted to confess. When Detective Alberto Morales heard about this, he first thought it was some kind of mistake. So far, there was no direct evidence in the case that would point to her. However, the girl was confident in her decision and wasn't going to keep quiet. When she sat down in front of the investigators, the atmosphere in the room changed. Everyone expected a shocking statement, but what came out of her mouth exceeded expectations. She said she had shot Fernando. Nahir spoke calmly. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't try to humor or change the subject. She claimed that Fernando was a violent man, that he had been abusing her for a long time, that he used physical force. According to her, he beat her. And on the day of their last meeting, she feared for her life. She said Fernando could snap at any minute. His behavior was unpredictable, and the last time they met, his aggression was out of control again. That's why she took a gun to protect herself if he tried to hit her. In her version, as they rode on the moped, he started yelling at her, grabbing her arms, and she realized she had to act. That's when she drew her gun and fired. At first, the police listened carefully to what she said. If her story checked out, it could explain a lot. Maybe it wasn't a planned murder, just self-defense. But the further the questioning went, the more inconsistencies emerged. The first thing that raised doubts among the investigators was the absence of any signs of beatings on Nahir's body. If she had indeed been beaten, there should have been bruises, abrasions or bruises on her skin, especially if she was grabbed while riding a moped. However, the doctors who examined her found none of these. The second important point is the nature of the murder. If Fernando had indeed attacked her while driving, how was she able to pull out a gun, aim, and hit him in the back? It didn't make sense. Investigators asked her another question. Why was the second shot fired? If the first shot was an act of self-defense, it would be logical to expect Nahir to try to run away, call for help or an ambulance, but instead, she fired another shot in the chest when Fernando was already on the ground and weakened. The police knew that a control shot is rarely an accident. It signifies a determination to see the case through to the end. The more questions the investigators asked, the less convincing Nahir's version looked. The investigators began fact-checking her words. They found that she had never previously reported abuse by Fernando. There had been no complaints, no contact with the police, not even a hint of such allegations. In addition, friends and acquaintances of the couple had never noticed any physical violence between them. They argued, could raise their voices at each other, but no one had ever seen bruises on Nahir or signs of struggle on Fernando's body. All this was in favor of the theory that Nahir was lying or trying to cover up the real reasons for the murder. While the interrogations were going on, investigators continued to examine the CCTV footage. Initially, it appeared that there were no cameras on the street where the murder took place that could capture the moment of the shooting. However, after several hours, they were able to find footage that turned out to be very important to the case. One of the cameras located near the crime scene managed to capture the moment when Nahir Galarza was returning home after the murder. When investigators viewed the footage, they were surprised. If this had been a crime of passion or an act of self-defense, it would be logical to expect that Nahir would have looked frightened, might have run or looked around for fear of repercussions. However, the footage showed the opposite. She walked calmly, did not look back, did not make any sudden movements. Her gait was confident, as if she was just returning home after an ordinary walk. This moment radically contradicted her version of the story. If she really killed Fernando in fear and self-defense, why did she just leave the scene? Investigators asked Nahir another key question. If her version was true, why didn't she call an ambulance? If she didn't intend to kill Fernando, why didn't she try to help him after the first shot? She didn't call for help, she didn't call anyone, she didn't stay at the scene. Instead, she just went home and the next day posted on social media as if nothing had happened. Her behavior didn't fit the reaction of someone who had just survived an assault and had to defend herself. It looked like cold-blooded, premeditated murder, and then trying to make it look like self-defense. The police now had a clear picture. 2 shots fired at close range, The second, a test shot, no attempt to call an ambulance. A steady gait on the way home, no sign of panic. Nahir claimed she was afraid of Fernando but could not explain how he could have attacked her while driving a moped. She said she wanted to defend herself but fired another shot when he was already wounded. The police finally concluded that it was premeditated murder and that the self-defense theory was just an attempt to avoid punishment. By the time the interrogation came to an end, the police had no doubt Nahir Galarza would be arrested. Her confession made it inevitable, and numerous inconsistencies undermined her defense. That night she was officially taken into custody. The police informed her that she would be brought to trial and that her case would then be treated as premeditated murder. After Nahir Galarza's arrest, her case caused a storm of public interest. The whole of Argentina followed the court proceedings, and the media discussed every detail of the crime. The question on everyone's mind was it really self-defense as the defendant claimed, or premeditated murder committed in cold blood? The prosecutor's office took a hard line from the beginning. 2 shots fired at close range, one of which was a control shot, spoke for themselves. Also alarming was Nahir's behavior after the murder. No attempt to help, leaving the scene, calmly returning home, posting on social media the next morning. None of this was consistent with the behavior of a person acting in a state of fear or affect. Prosecutors said that the crime was committed deliberately, and the defense version that Nahir put forward does not stand up to criticism. Nahir initially admitted that she shot Fernando because he was violent toward her. She stated that she had endured beatings and insults for a long time, but that night fear for her life made her take the gun. Fernando became aggressive, she said, and she had to defend herself. But when the trial began, her testimony changed dramatically. She now claimed that the murder was an accident. According to her new version, the gun accidentally went off in her pocket while she was sitting behind Fernando on the moped. She said she didn't even immediately realize what had happened. Then, when they fell off the moped, she raised the gun to realize what had happened, at which point the gun accidentally fired a second time, hitting Fernando in the chest. This account was strikingly different from her original confession. Now she completely denied the premeditated nature of the crime and tried to portray herself as the victim of a tragic accident. But the court had too many questions. The court did not accept Nahir's explanation. First, the experts examined her new statement and said that the gun could not have accidentally fired twice. The gun that was fired was in good working order, and an involuntary discharge was ruled out. Secondly, if the shot was fired in the pocket, the fabric of the clothes should have traces of gunpowder gases, but the expert examination did not find any such traces. The third major argument against Nahir concerned the second shot. The experts and the prosecutor's office argued it was a control shot. If the gun had actually fired accidentally at the moment she raised it, the bullet could have hit anywhere, but it struck Fernando in the chest. This spoke of a purposeful action. Also, the judges couldn't understand her behavior after the incident. If it was an accident, why did she just leave without calling an ambulance? Why didn't she call the police? Why didn't she even try to explain the situation to Fernando's family? Detectives also presented surveillance video of Nahir walking home confidently after the murder. If it were an accident, you'd expect her to cry, panic, run, but the footage showed a calm and confident gait. These facts shattered her defense. The judges concluded that her behavior was not consistent with that of a person who was in shock from a tragedy. Throughout the trial, Nahir's defense tried to acquit her, but numerous inconsistencies, contradictory testimony, and ballistic expertise did their job. There was a tense silence in the courtroom on the day of the verdict announcement. Fernando's parents waited for justice. Friends of the victim listened to the last word of the judge with bated breath. On July 3, 2018, the court of Gualeguaychú, Entre Rios province, found Nahir Galarza guilty of the premeditated murder of Fernando Pastorizo. On July 6, 2018, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Emily Sarah Aberly Murray was born on February 19, 1980, in the town of Slippery Hollow, New York, but spent most of her life in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Her parents, Thomas and Cynthia Murray, were a loving, intelligent couple who instilled in their daughter a passion for knowledge, independence, and the pursuit of goodness. There was always a warm atmosphere in the family. Emily loved listening to her father talk about philosophy and theology, and her mother taught her to see the beauty in caring for others. From childhood, she took a keen interest in the world around her, participated in church activities, and often helped out at the local parish. During her school years, she was drawn to the humanities, especially philosophy, and so when it came time to choose her future profession, she firmly decided to devote herself to serving people and becoming a minister in the Episcopal Church. At Kenyon College, one of the oldest liberal arts colleges in the United States, she studied philosophy. An excellent student, an activist, a person with amazing kindness, she easily found a common language with others and often became the center of any company. Classmates recall that next to her there was a feeling of warmth and support. Her laughter was ringing and sincere. She loved to travel and dreamed that one day she would preach in the ancient cathedrals of Europe. Once she even went to Oxford for a semester, where she immersed herself in the study of philosophy and theology, walking the cobbled streets of the ancient city and being inspired by its history. Like many students, she needed money for everyday expenses, so she took a job as a waitress at Pirates Cove, a local restaurant just 100 yards from her dormitory. She worked there for a few months, and it was there that she met Gregory McKnight. He was a few years older than her, worked in the kitchen, and hadn't attracted much attention at first. Tall, sturdy, with a quiet voice and an impenetrable expression, he kept to himself. But sometimes he was unexpectedly friendly. Emily never paid much attention to him, but colleagues said he was particularly attentive to her. At one point, he even stood up for her when one of the employees flirted with her too insistently, after which he became even more withdrawn. On the evening of November 2, 2000, Emily finished her last shift at Pirates Cove. She decided to quit her job to focus on her studies. It was a momentous day. Her friends decided to come to the restaurant to celebrate her leaving. They sat at tables, joking around, remembering funny stories about her work, promising to come here even without her, just to drop in for a cup of coffee once in a while, and reminisce about the evenings they spent together. Emily laughed, saying she would probably miss this place. Even the old coffee machine that was always breaking down and the endless orders from customers who didn't know what they wanted. The guests started to leave around midnight, and Emily stayed until closing time, helping to clean tables and count the cash register. The bartender, Nathaniel Justice, remembered that at about 3 a.m. she was still in the lounge looking for her keys. He joked that maybe they had decided to hide so she couldn't leave. But Emily only grinned. Then she walked out, saying that she had another full year of college ahead of her and that now that she was free from work, she'd have more time for her friends. Nathaniel gave her a look, watching her disappear out the door, and that was the last time anyone who knew her saw her. She was expected at the party, but she never showed up. Her friends didn't pay much attention to it at first, thinking she was tired and had just gone to bed. But when she didn't show up for class in the morning and didn't answer a single phone call, concern began to grow. First, one of them ran to her dormitory, but she wasn't there. Her bed was neatly made and her wallet with her credit cards and driver's license was on the table next to it. The car was nowhere to be found. They started calling everyone who might have seen her, but no one knew where she might have gone after work. By late afternoon, the anxiety had become almost panicky. Emily never disappeared without warning. She always left notes, always let everyone know where she would be. Not showing up to a party, not calling her parents, it wasn't like her. The girl seemed to disappear into the night, leaving behind only silence and anxious anticipation. The morning of November 3 began with an alarm. Emily Murray did not show up for any of her lectures, did not answer any of her phone calls, and her absence could no longer be explained as an accident. Emily's friend Loretta Frost, one of the first to worry the night before, went to her dorm again, hoping it was all just a ridiculous misunderstanding. The car was nowhere to be found, which meant that wherever she went, she did it in her Subaru Outback. By noon, worried friends gathered in Loretta's room. Worry gradually turned to panic. Some tried to convince themselves that Emily had simply decided to go into seclusion, while others found this theory unconvincing. She couldn't just pick up and disappear, leave her belongings behind, not even taking her wallet. If she wanted a break from everyone, at least she would have warned someone. The more they thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Someone suggested calling her parents in New York. It wasn't an easy decision. No one wanted to scare Thomas and Cynthia Murray in vain, but the situation demanded action. After a short hesitation, Loretta dialed the number. Cynthia's voice came through the phone, at first cheerful but gradually changing to worried as Loretta reported that Emily was missing. Thomas immediately joined the conversation, filling in the details. They confirmed the worst. Emily hadn't called them, hadn't left any messages, and they didn't know where she was either. If she was okay, she'd be in touch. That was the turning point. There was no longer any doubt something had gone wrong. The friends decided to take the next step, contacting the police. Officers arrived at Kenyon College on the afternoon of Nova 3. Two police officers, Detective Surgeon John Lancaster and his partner Stephen Harris, began by looking around her dorm room. They scrutinized everything but, like Emily's friends, found no signs of a struggle or signs of forced entry. It seemed that Emily had simply left, closing the door behind her, and never returned. They noticed her wallet, identification, and credit cards, but nothing else of significance was found. The next step was to look for her car. The car's disappearance complicated matters. If Emily had truly left of her own free will, she could have traveled far, but if she had been abducted, the vehicle could be a key piece of evidence. At this point, it was the only tangible object that could lead the police to answers. The first hypothesis investigators considered was that the girl had simply decided to spend time alone with herself. Perhaps she needed to think, to put her thoughts in order after her dismissal from Pirates Cove, before the upcoming exams. But that theory weakened quickly. Emily never disappeared like that without telling anyone, especially her parents. Besides, if she had just decided to leave, she would have at least taken her purse. The second theory was kidnapping. That hypothesis was looking more and more likely. Emily hadn't shown up in almost 24 hours, hadn't made contact, and her car had disappeared with her. A kidnapping usually required some preparation, and if this was true, it meant that the perpetrator knew Emily, knew her routine, and took advantage of the moment when she was alone. That was what was most frightening. The police began the next phase of the investigation, interviews with Emily's friends, parents, and co-workers. They needed to understand who she was close to, who she had socialized with in the last few days, whether she had tensions with anyone. The investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear it would be a complicated case. The search for the girl continued, but so far it had been fruitless. The car was not found on the college campus, nor in nearby parking lots, nor in the Gambier area. There was no trace of Emily, and with each passing minute, the hope for her safe return was fading. After the police had inspected Emily's dormitory and verified that she had left no notes or other traces leading to her location, the first interviews began. The investigators realized that time was playing against them. Every minute lost reduced the chance of finding the girl alive. The first logical group to interview were the friends who were expecting her at the party. Emily's friends gathered in a small room set aside by the college to talk to the investigators. The tension in the room was palpable. The students still couldn't believe what was happening. Loretta Frost, Emily's closest friend, was the first to speak. She described the evening at Pirates Cove when they came to celebrate her last day at work. We sat at tables, joking around, reminiscing about how she accidentally mixed up orders or how she always had the most generous tips. It was hilarious. She laughed with us. Loretta looked down, clenching her fingers. I can't believe she just Others present confirmed. Emily was in good spirits, didn't complain, showed no signs of anxiety. Investigators tried to determine if any of the friends could have been involved. They were all at the party when Emily finished her shift, which means they all had alibis. Besides, if the kidnapper had been among them, he wouldn't have been so active in the search. The friends were above suspicion. The next step was to talk to Emily's parents, Thomas and Cynthia Murray. They arrived in Gambier on the morning of November 5, overwhelmed with anxiety and fatigue from a sleepless night. Detective Lancaster motioned for them to sit down before beginning their conversation. Thomas spoke first. "Emily would never disappear like that. She's not the type to run away. If she wanted a break from everyone, she would have left a note or at least called us." He fell silent, struggling with his emotions. It's not her." Cynthia nodded. "We talked to her 2 days ago. She was happy, talking about her plans for her studies, how glad she was that she'd have more time for philosophy now. If something was bothering her, she'd tell me. She always talked." Investigators asked about possible conflicts, about people with whom Emily might have felt tension. The parents shook their heads negatively. She didn't have any enemies. She was so kind. If she had problems, she solved them with words, not conflict. They couldn't give the investigation any new information, but their desperate belief that Emily would never have disappeared of her own free will strengthened the abduction theory. Investigators returned to Pirates Cove to interview Emily's co-workers. First up was bartender Nathaniel Justice, the last person to see her before she disappeared. "I was standing behind the bar when she was looking for her keys. She looked at me, grinned, and said something like, 'They probably just decided to hide from me.' I laughed, saying that maybe it was a sign that it was time for her to stay working here permanently. Then she left and I never saw her again." Investigators scrutinized his reactions, but he didn't seem nervous or confused in his statements. When the police decided to check his file, they found nothing suspicious. Justice was a regular guy who worked in a bar, had no criminal record and no criminal ties. He came up clean. But the next restaurant employee raised more questions. When it was Gregory McKnight's turn to be interviewed, the atmosphere changed. Unlike Nathaniel, he didn't look worried, more like annoyed. He sat with his arms crossed, answering one-word answers. McKnight answered dryly, avoiding unnecessary words. He was friendly with the staff, but he didn't let people get too close to him. Those who knew him claimed he was always like that. He didn't fit in, kept to himself. No one could say he was Emily's friend, but he had no enemies. After the conversation ended, the detectives decided to do a background check. They requested his file and soon discovered something unexpected. McKnight had been in trouble with the law before. In 1992, when he was just 15 years old, he shot and killed a man in Columbus. For that, he served time at the Circleville Youth Center Correctional Center and was released in 1997. He then married former correctional officer Catherine McKnight and settled in Gambier. That information changed the course of the investigation. Up until that point, police had no real suspect, but now there was the first person who raised questions. His past, strange behavior under questioning, and dry, curt answers made them wary. While the police dealt with McKnight, the search for Emily didn't stop. Volunteers scoured the neighborhood, checking roads, wooded areas, trying to find any trace of her car. But nothing. The girl seemed to disappear. Meanwhile, the investigators knew they had to take the next step, to scrutinize McKnight's life. Perhaps there was something behind his silent, withdrawn personality that would help solve the mystery of Emily Murray's disappearance. It's been just over a month since Emily Murray's disappearance. The police continued to investigate, but clues to her whereabouts were woefully lacking. However, fate intervened in an unexpected way. In early December, investigators received new information. It turned out that Emily Murray was not the only person who had gone missing this year. In May 2000, 20-year-old Greg Julius disappeared in Chillicothe, Ohio. His girlfriend, Dana Bostic, reported to police that he had not been in contact since the spring. Upon investigation, detectives determined that one of his last known stops was a home in a rural area near Rayo. That home belonged to Gregory McKnight. This coincidence could not be ignored. In Emily's case, the police did not yet have direct evidence against McKnight, but Julius' disappearance and his possible connection to McKnight gave a legitimate reason to arrest him. The prosecutor's office authorized his arrest on another case, and police went to his trailer. On December 9, 2000, investigators arrived at McKnight's trailer, located in the middle of nowhere near the small community of Ray. However, he was not at the site. The trailer looked abandoned and the doors were locked. But the most important shock awaited the police officers not inside, but outside. On the lot next to the trailer stood a dark green Subaru Outback. It was Emily Murray's car. Officers immediately requested a search warrant. Given the discovery, a judge quickly granted permission. A few hours later, a forensics team broke inside the trailer. The first thing they smelled was the musty odor of decomposition. Once inside, police officers illuminated the room with flashlights. The picture was chaotic, scattered things, clothes, garbage, but their attention was immediately drawn to the dark stains on the carpet in the hallway. The experienced criminalist immediately realized it was blood. The footprints led down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. There, in the far corner of the room, among a pile of old junk, they found the body of Emily Murray. It was wrapped in a rug that had already begun to decompose. Investigators could not immediately believe their eyes. After a month of searching, the girl was found, but not alive. An inspection of the trailer brought even more shocking discoveries. Right in the living room, in one of the drawers, they found 5 0.357 Magnum shell casings. In another drawer in the bedroom, they found 7 9mm bullets. These findings immediately became important clues. If McKnight had such a weapon at his disposal, there was a good chance that it had been used in the murder. But the grisly findings didn't end there. In the living room, among the chaos of scattered things, the police came across a package with a bloody piece of gray Scotch tape. Nearby were signs of a struggle, a broken chair, bloodstains that, at first glance, didn't seem too noticeable. They also found a thin trail of dried blood on the hallway floor, leading from the front door to the bedroom where Emily's body had been hidden. This indicated that the girl had been killed here and then dragged to another room where she had been left. But perhaps the most gruesome discovery awaited investigators outside the trailer. After the discovery of Emily Murray's body, forensic investigators continued to survey the area around Gregory McKnight's trailer. Despite the December chill, the damp ground held new mysteries. They scrutinized every corner of the property, trying to find additional clues. It was then that one of the investigators noticed a patch of ground that looked disturbed. The ground was loose, as if it had been recently dug up. As the shovels began to sink into the ground, burnt pieces of cloth showed up from underneath. Soon after, human bones were discovered. They were lying shallow, as if someone had been in a hurry to get rid of the body. Experts quickly realized that the remains had been exposed to fire. The bones were partially charred, and fabric found nearby showed signs of burning. Someone had tried to cover up the crime, but burning the body completely failed. That wasn't the only find, however. A little farther from the trailer was an old abandoned well, which also attracted the attention of investigators. Inside, among the garbage and dirt, they came across more remains, fragments of bones, pieces of clothing and shoes. The clothes were partially destroyed, but one of the items retained patterns that later helped identify the victim. The examination took several days, but the first results showed that the remains belonged to Greg Julius, a 20-year-old Chillicothe resident who had been missing since the spring of 2000s. This was irrefutable proof. McKnight was the killer even before Emily disappeared. Now the police had to find out what connected him to the two victims and how he chose those he decided to kill. After the gruesome findings in Gregory McKnight's trailer, investigators realized they couldn't wait any longer. He was dangerous, and every missed moment could give him a chance to escape. Operatives launched an urgent manhunt, tracking his last movements. McKnight didn't show up in his trailer or his usual places, but soon he was spotted near the town of Chillicothe. He moved quietly, as if unaware that he was already being hunted. On December 10, 2000s, police caught up with him near a gas station. They surrounded him, gave him clear instructions not to resist. But McKnight wasn't going to. He held up his hands and let himself be handcuffed, showing neither fear nor surprise. His face remained impassive, as if what was happening did not concern him. At the station, the charges were read to him: double murder, kidnapping, illegal possession of weapons. He listened to them silently, without asking questions, without trying to justify himself. The investigators watched his reactions carefully, but saw no remorse or excitement. He had a trial ahead of him, and with the evidence found in the trailer, He had no chance of getting away with it. After McKnight's arrest, the investigation continued. The police now had overwhelming evidence linking him to the murders. Preparing for trial, prosecutors began putting together a case that would get him the maximum sentence. But one question remained. Why did he kill Emily? She had no particular conflict with him, no animosity toward him. Did that mean her death was accidental, or was it premeditated? These questions were to be answered during the trial. Meanwhile, Kenyon College and the entire local community were shocked by the news. The entire town, Emily's friends and family, had hoped for a miracle, but ended up facing a harsh reality. Now everyone waited for the trial in which McKnight would have to answer for what he had done. After Gregory McKnight's arrest, the investigation did a thorough job of preparing for the trial. The prosecutor's office was confident that they had enough evidence to prove the defendant's guilt and were preparing to present it to the jury. The principal evidence was the recovered bodies of the two victims, traces of blood in the trailer, gun casings, and bullets, and Emily Murray's stolen automobile, which was parked right next to McKnight's residence. McKnight himself behaved the same way at all stages of the investigation. He made no confessions, did not cooperate with detectives, and did not attempt to justify himself. His face remained impassive and his demeanor cold. This only strengthened the confidence of investigators that before them a real predator, a man who knows neither fear nor remorse. The trial began on October 5, 2022, in the courthouse in Vinton County, Ohio. In the hall were present not only lawyers but also numerous journalists, Emily's classmates, her teachers, as well as parents of the murdered. The general atmosphere was tense. Everyone realized that what was at stake was not just a murder case, but a question of justice and punishment for the crimes that had shaken the local community. At the first hearing, the prosecutor presented the main evidence and immediately outlined the main line of the prosecution's case. McKnight had committed two brutal murders, kidnapped and held Emily, and then disposed of the bodies in cold blood, hiding them in his trailer and yard. During the trial, the court heard testimony from Emily's parents, friends, and co-workers. Each of them spoke warmly of her, remembering what a kind, intelligent, and dreamy girl she was, who never hurt anyone. Thomas and Cynthia Murray, speaking in court, could not hold back tears. Emily's father talked about how their daughter dreamed of becoming a priest, how she loved to travel and help people. Her mother recalled her childhood years, talking about the letters Emily wrote to them from college, her love of books, and her dreams for the future. When it came to talking about the evidence found, the room froze. The forensic scientist, who was the first to enter McKnight's trailer after obtaining the search warrant, detailed how they found Emily's body wrapped in a rug in one of the bedrooms. He described bloodstains in the hallway, signs of a struggle found in the living room, and then presented the court with photographs of bullets and shell casings found in drawers. But the most difficult moment of the trial was the account of the second body. The judges and jurors could hardly conceal their shock as the expert described how the remains of Greg Julius had been found in a hole behind the trailer and in an old abandoned well. There was complete silence in the room as the prosecutor presented photographs of the dig site. It was obvious that McKnight had tried to burn the body but had not followed through. Greg Julius' girlfriend Dana Bostic, who was present, couldn't stand it and cried when she heard police find his burned clothes and bone fragments in the well. She told how she waited for his call, how she hoped he had just disappeared for a little while, but he couldn't be gone forever. The defense and strategy of the attorneys. Gregory McKnight's lawyers tried to build a defense on doubt. They argued that the evidence was insufficient, that the bullets found could have belonged to anyone, that the blood in the trailer could have been there long before these events. They claimed that someone could have planted the bodies in the trailer to frame McKnight, but those arguments were unconvincing. The main blow to the defense came from a forensic scientist who explained that all the evidence found was chronologically consistent with the time of Emily and Greg Julius' disappearance. Ballistics experts proved that the .357 Magnum cartridge casings matched the bullet found in Emily's head, and DNA experts determined that the blood on the trailer floor was hers. In an additional blow to the defense, Emily's car was found near McKnight's house. There was no way he could explain how her car ended up there, and this finally convinced the jury that he was involved in her murder. After weeks of hearings, the court reached a verdict. On October 10, 2002, the Vinton County Court found Gregory McKnight guilty of the murder of Emily Murray, the murder of Greg Julius, kidnapping, unlawful possession of a weapon, and several other crimes. On October 25, 2002, Gregory McKnight was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The court also added 38 years in prison to his sentence for other offenses, including car theft, kidnapping, and unlawful possession of a weapon. Gregory McKnight is still on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Chillicothe, Ohio. Despite the conviction, the death penalty has not yet been carried out. The Christmas season of 1961 was, as it always is in Newfoundland, harsh, frosty, with piercing winds and snowdrifts plunging the streets of small towns into white silence. In one of the families in these parts, January 28, 1961, a girl was born, who was named Shirley Jane Turner. Her parents were simple people, without high wealth, but with a firm character. Her father made his living in the fishing industry. Like many in the area, he was also a former U.S. serviceman, and her mother took care of the home and the children. Shirley grew up determined and ambitious. Already in early childhood, she showed a difficult character. She easily went to the conflict, defending her point of view, was often stubborn and irascible. At school, she showed good results but had few friends. Her persistence and tendency to dominance sometimes repelled others. It was difficult to change her mind. She never admitted to mistakes, and if something did not go according to her plan, became aggressive. Nevertheless, her persistence paid off. She enrolled at Memorial University of Newfoundland, choosing to study medicine. Shirley dreamed of a career as a doctor, longing for the recognition and respect she felt she deserved. But along with this, a sense of superiority grew in her. She did not tolerate criticism and always thought that she knew better how things should be. Her personal life was more complicated. She had relationships over the years growing up, but many didn't stand up to her character. She married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. From these unions, she was left with 3 children, but gradually they began to spend more time with their fathers or other relatives. Shirley herself decided that family was not her calling and focused on her career, becoming a fully independent woman. By the end of the 90s, Turner was already a certified doctor, worked in various medical institutions, and continued to move up the career ladder. She seemed strong, determined, but her character made her a loner. It was during this period that she met the man who seemed like he could change her life. A young doctor named Andrew Bugbee. Andrew David Bugbee was born on September 21, 1973, to David and Kate Bugbee. Unlike Shirley, his childhood was filled with warmth and care. He grew up in sunny California, where he was surrounded by loving family and friends. From an early age, he showed friendliness, responsiveness, and desire to help people. Andrew easily found a common language with others, able to listen and support. At school, he was a favorite of teachers and friends, the very person on whom you can rely. His dream of medicine appeared in childhood, and he confidently went to its realization. After graduating from high school, he entered medical school, then did his residency in Pennsylvania. His friends and colleagues admired his kindness and sense of humor. He was someone who was always there to help, whether it was patients, friends, or casual acquaintances. By the early 2000s, his career was gaining momentum. He was a promising doctor, and a future full of opportunity lay ahead of him. But that's when Shirley Turner came into his life. Andrew and Shirley met in a medical environment when they both worked in a hospital. What initially brought them together was their shared passion for medicine, talking about work and research. Despite the age difference, Shirley was 13 years older than Andrew. A romantic relationship developed between them. This union looked strange to others. Andrew, a young, kind, energetic man surrounded by friends, and Shirley, demanding, irascible, prone to manipulation. Their relationship was not peaceful from the beginning. Shirley possessed possessive tendencies. She was jealous of Andrew's friends, his co-workers, even his parents. She demanded accountability for every move, constantly making a scene if things didn't go her way. Andrew, being a soft person, tried to avoid conflicts, but gradually began to change, became less open, more tense. Friends noticed that something was going wrong but could not intervene. Every time the relationship reached an impasse, Shirley manipulated the situation so that Andrew stayed with her. But in the fall of 2001, he finally made a decision. He could no longer tolerate her tantrums, controlling behavior, and constant accusations. In early November, he told her he was breaking up. November 5, 2001 was a cold and stressful night for Andrew. He had been working at the hospital all day and had to meet with Shirley in the evening. She insisted on talking, saying they needed to discuss things one last time. He agreed, but his co-workers noticed he didn't seem convinced. "I just want her to realize it's over," he told one friend before leaving. That night, Andrew didn't come home. His phone wasn't answering. No one knew where he was. At first, friends and colleagues did not panic. It's not much. Perhaps he decided to take a break, to spend the evening alone. But with each passing hour, the anxiety grew. The next morning, November 6, passers-by walking in a parking lot near a lake in Pennsylvania noticed something strange. On the pavement, among the fallen leaves, a man lay motionless. Frightened people immediately called the police and an ambulance. Within minutes, officers from the local police department arrived on the scene. EMTs quickly confirmed what was already obvious. The man was dead. Police officers began a search of the area. The man was found in an unnatural pose, his body slightly turned as if he had tried to get up or move at the last moment. There were traces of blood on his clothes and around his body, and several dark stains on the pavement suggested that death had occurred here. The first major discovery was the bullet marks. Upon examining the body, the officers noticed several small lacerations in the chest and face area. This was not an accident, there was a murder in front of them. Medical examiners on the scene confirmed the death and reported several gunshot wounds. No weapon was found nearby, which ruled out the suicide version. Now the first task for the police was to identify the deceased. In the pockets of the man's clothes were found keys, phone, and wallet. Inside the wallet were a driver's license, medical records, and several bank cards. According to the documents, Andrew David Bugbee, a 28-year-old physician who worked at a local hospital, was lying in front of the officers. To confirm his identity, officers contacted the hospital where Bugbee worked. Several of his co-workers expressed shock and immediately confirmed that he had indeed failed to show up for his shift. The next step was to notify his family. Bagby's parents, who lived in the U.S., received the terrible news from police officers. Their son had been found dead. Now the investigation had a name for the victim: ballistics forensics, the weapon of crime. Initial autopsy and forensic results showed that Bugbee had been killed by several shots at point-blank range. To find out more details, the police called in ballistics experts. A few days later, the ballistics experts provided a report that shed light on the details of the crime. It was determined that the murder was committed with a .22 caliber handgun. The shots were fired at close range, indicating a personal motive. A total of 5 shots were fired to the chest, face, neck, and head. This manner of killing spoke of a violent personal motivation. This was not a random shootout or robbery. The perpetrator had purposefully ensured that Bugbee would not survive. Now the police needed to figure out who might have wanted him dead. As officers began interviewing Bugbee's co-workers and friends, Shirley Turner's name began to appear all too often. One by one, his acquaintances revealed that their relationship with Shirley was strained, full of arguments, jealousy, and manipulation. Doctors who worked with Bugbee said he wanted to break up with her, but she was unwilling to accept it. Some recalled that she was emotionally unstable, prone to outbursts of anger. Bugbee's parents also confirmed that their son was afraid of Turner and tried to end his relationship with her. Police realized Shirley Turner was the prime suspect. Their job now was to locate her at the time of the murder and see if she could have purchased or possessed a .22 caliber weapon. After Shirley Turner's name began to come up in every conversation with Bagby's co-workers and acquaintances, police began searching for her. The first task was to determine where she was on the day of the murder and what she had been doing in recent weeks. Investigators made a request to check her recent movements, including travel information, transportation tickets, surveillance footage, and any signs of activity that could help reconstruct her itinerary. It was obvious that she had been under a great deal of emotional stress since her breakup with Bugbee, but the question remained: where had she gone since their last meeting? At the same time, her phone records were being checked. The police analyzed incoming and outgoing calls, especially in the days leading up to the murder. Was there an attempt to contact the victim? If so, with what motive? Also of interest were her conversations with other people. Perhaps she shared her thoughts or mentioned plans to someone. In addition, the investigators began to examine her financial transactions, withdrawals, purchases in stores, possible purchases that could shed light on her intentions. Expenses in the final days before the murder were particularly scrutinized. At first glance, the police had ample reason to view Shirley Turner as the prime suspect. Her relationship with Bugbee had been strained, the breakup had been accompanied by emotional outbursts, and their last meeting had taken place shortly before the murder. For now, however, this was only circumstantial evidence. Investigators had more evidence to find. The key was to establish her whereabouts at the time of the crime. At the moment, the police did not know where she was or what she had been doing since her last conversation with Bugbee. This required a thorough analysis of her movements, phone calls, and financial transactions. Realizing that with each passing day the chance of finding important clues was diminishing, investigators began to work faster. They needed to gather enough evidence to make formal charges and take the next step. But most importantly, they had to keep an eye on the suspect before she disappeared for good. The first thing the police noticed was the victim's phone calls. The day before the murder, November 4, 2001, Andrew had several conversations with Shirley Turner. It was clear from the call records that he did not initiate these conversations. On the contrary, it was Turner who persistently called him, and at some point he answered. Their conversation lasted a few minutes and was followed a short time later by another, longer one. After reviewing testimony from Bugbee's co-workers and friends, police were able to surmise that the conversation was not a pleasant one. Most likely Shirley was pressuring Andrew, trying to convince him to meet with her one last time. He hesitated, but eventually agreed, perhaps to put a definitive end to their relationship. It was now up to the police to establish where Shirley Turner herself was at that moment. It was known that she lived in Iowa, but her phone activity and travel records told a different story. It turned out that on November 4, she had traveled several hundred miles, leaving Iowa and heading to Pennsylvania. The journey looked strange, but it became even more suspicious when investigators discovered that she had stopped in another state along the way. That fact didn't seem important at first, but after a police check it became clear that detour in her itinerary was no accident. It was there that she picked up a firearm. She had purchased a .22 caliber handgun shortly before. Paperwork confirmed that she legally owned the firearm, and after the purchase she signed up for firearms training. Her shooting instructor said Turner showed an interest in practicing accurate hits and regularly visiting the range. However, there was something unusual about her behavior. She wasn't just learning to shoot. Her training was intense, focused, as if she was preparing for something specific. But the most curious thing happened on the eve of the murder. The instructor told police that on Non-3, the day before Bugbee's last call, Shirley came to the range but looked worried. She said her gun was missing. At the time, no one paid much attention to it. Little did they know perhaps it was really lost. But now this information looked very different. Investigators began to suspect that this statement was made deliberately to prepare an alibi in advance in case the gun was found after the murder. Further analysis of the data confirmed that on November 4, after Shirley contacted Andrew, she was indeed in Pennsylvania. And then another important piece of evidence surfaced. Eyewitnesses near the parking lot near the lake where Bugbee's body was later found said they saw two cars that evening, a Toyota Corolla and a Toyota RAV4. This was particularly significant because the former belonged to Andrew Bugbee and the latter to Shirley Turner. This became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. If Turner's car was there, then she was also at the crime scene. Now the police realized that the version of her involvement in the murder was becoming more and more obvious. But before formal charges could be brought, investigators had to determine what had happened to Shirley after the murder. This was critical, because if they could prove that she had left the country in a hurry, it would look like an attempt to escape justice. They soon found the answer. On November 12, 2001, just days after the murder, Turner left the United States. She flew out of the airport in Toronto and then headed to St. John's, a small town in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. That's where she settled. She may not have had a clear plan, but one thing was clear: she wanted to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. While the police were working on her movements, another department was looking at her correspondence and personal records. It was then that investigators made an unexpected discovery. Shirley was pregnant. Her emails to Bugbee were about the baby, about being there for him, about taking responsibility. In one message, she practically begged him to change his mind. But Bagby's friends and co-workers said he doubted the sincerity of those words. He didn't believe a child would make a difference and felt Turner was using this as a way to keep him. Later, while searching her belongings, the police found ultrasound scans that finally confirmed Shirley Turner's pregnancy. This discovery added even more complications to the case. Now, in addition to the legal intricacies of her move to Canada, there was another factor. She was carrying the victim's child. Now, investigators faced a real problem. They were sure that Turner was guilty, but it was no longer possible to arrest her on U.S. soil. They had to start the extradition process, which meant months of legal battles. The police realized that time was playing against them. If Shirley could find good lawyers in time, if the Canadian system decided not to extradite her to U.S. authorities, the investigation could reach a dead end. But what worried investigators most was that Turner could disappear even further. She had already left the country, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't move again. Her pregnancy could have been a shield of sorts for her, a defense against prosecution, and police had to act quickly before it was too late. After police located Shirley Turner in Canada, a complicated extradition process began. U.S. authorities charged her with first-degree murder and sent a formal request to the Canadian government. Canadian law enforcement authorities, after reviewing the evidence received, decided to arrest her. On December 12, 2001, Shirley Turner was arrested in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. For investigators, this marked the first big step toward justice. The joy, however, was premature. It soon became clear that the case would be more complicated than first imagined. After his arrest, the judge hearing the case made an unexpected ruling. Despite the murder charges, he declared that Turner was not a threat to society. This conclusion was based on the fact that the crime was personal and not a threat to the general public. The Canadian court system at the time worked in such a way that suspects who did not pose a threat were often allowed to remain at large until their case was heard. That's what happened to Shirley. Shortly after her arrest, the court approved her release on a bail of 75,000 Canadian dollars. However, her freedom was limited. The court ordered Shirley Turner to surrender her passport to eliminate the possibility of fleeing abroad. She was also prohibited from leaving Newfoundland and Labrador without special permission from the court. In addition, she was required to report regularly to the police station for marking, to be supervised, and to comply with court-ordered conditions. In addition, she was strictly prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms to minimize the potential danger to others. Despite all these restrictions, the main thing remained the same. Turner was free, and the extradition process was turning into a real legal battle. The news of Turner's pregnancy soon became a central factor that changed the entire defense strategy. While the U.S. side was preparing documents for her extradition, a very different legal story began in Canada. The case was no longer just about murder. It was now about custody of a child who had not yet been born. The Canadian court system was faced with an issue that complicated matters. If Turner was extradited to the U.S., her child would either be born in prison or left motherless. The judges could not ignore this fact, and it began to influence their decisions. Meanwhile, Andrew Bugby's parents, David and Kate Bugby, were shocked by what was happening. They learned that their daughter-in-law was pregnant, and despite their grief, they made a firm decision they must fight for custody of the child. Shortly after Turner's arrest, they moved to Canada to be closer to the events and to follow the trial. They were to face enormous legal challenges. The laws in Canada that protected the rights of the mother made the situation extremely difficult. Despite the allegations against Turner, her pregnancy gave her a huge advantage in court. David and Kate Bugby were convinced that their grandson deserved a normal childhood, not a life alongside a woman accused of murdering his father. But the system didn't work that easily. On July 18, 2002, Zachary Turner, Andrew Bugby's son, was born in a St. John's hospital. That moment changed everything. With the birth of the child, the case took an even more confusing turn. Where before it was about Turner's potential extradition, now it became much more complicated. The judges realized that if they agreed to extradition, the infant would either be left motherless or forced to move to the United States. This called into question the very possibility of extraditing Shirley to the American authorities. Shirley Turner felt it. If her position had been precarious before, now she felt much more secure. The system no longer viewed her simply as an accused murderer. She was now the mother of a baby, and that gave her a huge advantage. She realized that with the baby in her arms, she could avoid extradition. Her main strategy now was to present herself not as a woman who had killed her former lover, but as a caring mother who wanted to be unjustly separated from her son. At the same time, Bugby's parents did not give up. They continued to seek custody of Zachary, arguing that a mother accused of murdering his father could not provide the child with a safe childhood. However, the courts continued to hesitate. For Shirley, on the other hand, life began to fall into place. Despite public pressure, she began to feel stable. She knew that the likelihood of her extradition with the baby was greatly reduced, and she made the most of it. Now that she had her son in her arms, she began to act confidently, creating the image of a good mother. She even started applying for financial aid, saying in interviews that she just wanted to live a quiet life and raise her son. But for David and Kate Bugby, this situation was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the fate of their grandson. They realized that if the courts continued to protect Turner, the child would remain in the hands of the woman they believed was his father's killer. With each passing day, the situation grew more complicated. What started out as a murder charge turned into a long and complicated custody battle. U.S. police and prosecutors continued to insist that Shirley Turner should be extradited to the U.S., but the Canadian court system was increasingly inclined to keep her in the country. The birth of the baby changed everything. Judges now had to consider not only the evidence of murder, but also the welfare of the infant. And that factor tipped the scales more and more in Turner's favor. As the lawyers struggled in the courts, Shirley continued to play her game. She realized that time was working for her. The longer she stayed in Canada, the harder it was for the American side to get her extradited. For Buggy's parents, it was a nightmare. After Zachary Turner was born, his fate became the subject of a bitter legal battle. Andrew Bugby's parents, David and Kate, realized that leaving the child with Shirley was not only morally wrong, but dangerous. They began an active custody battle, asking the court to recognize them as the boy's primary caregivers. The first months after the birth of the child showed that Zachary felt more comfortable in the company of grandparents than with his mother. Eyewitnesses who observed their interaction noted that the boy reacted more calmly to the presence of David and Kate, was more willing to spend time with them, and even began to cry when he was handed over to his mother. Shirley, despite her legal victory, showed little concern for the child. It seemed that to her he was more a tool for her extradition defense than an object of maternal love. Many acquaintances of the family noticed that she often left the boy in the care of others, neglected him, and generally did not appear to be a caring mother. Tension between Turner and Bugby's parents continued to build. At one point, the situation went so far that she even fired her family lawyer when she learned that he was expressing sympathy for David and Kate. She no longer trusted anyone. Despite the legal confusion, Shirley Turner's extradition to the United States remained possible. In November 2002, she was again imprisoned pending a decision by Canada's federal justice minister. The ministry had to determine whether to extradite her to U.S. authorities. David and Kate Bugbee hoped this would be the end of an agonizing story. They believed that justice would finally be served and Shirley would be forced to stand trial for the murder of their son. But that hope quickly crumbled. In January 2003, the court made an unexpected and shocking decision. Shirley Turner was released again. The judge ruled that her crime was not a threat to the community, and that the murder of Andrew Bugbee was a personal tragedy, not a public danger. Turner was now officially presumed innocent. She was once again free to live in Canada, which meant her chances of avoiding extradition became even better. On August 18, 2003, Zachary remained in the custody of his mother. Despite David and Kate Bugbee's best efforts, the court did not give them the right to care for the child, and he remained with the woman they believed to be their son's killer. That day, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Turner was in her home in St. John's when she made a terrible decision. She spiked the baby's food with lorazepam, a powerful sedative that causes drowsiness and mental depression. As Zachary ate, the drug began to take effect. The child became increasingly lethargic and gradually fell asleep. Shortly thereafter, Shirley herself took a lethal dose of the same drug. She was not going to leave any chance for herself or her son. When Zachary was completely unconscious, Turner put warm clothes on him, then tied him to her chest with a sweater so that he could not get free. She then left the house, headed for the fishing pier, and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. Shirley and Zachary's bodies were found breathless on shore the same day. Sea currents carried them to land where they were discovered by passers-by. Rescuers were called immediately, but it was too late. The child and his mother were dead. Michael Eugene Williams was born on October 16, 1969 in Breckenridge, Florida, to Jerry and Cheryl Williams. His parents were people of traditional views. His father worked as a construction worker. His mother worked in school administration. They instilled in their son honesty, hard work, and religious values. From childhood, Mike showed himself as a responsible and purposeful child. He early learned independence, helping his parents around the house, and spent his free time outdoors. Like many boys in his town, he was fond of hunting and fishing. His father often took him with him to water bodies and taught him the wisdom of hunting. In school, Mike was one of the best students. He was characterized by diligence, perseverance, and friendly character, for which he was loved by teachers and peers. He actively participated in school life, played on the soccer team, and despite his natural modesty, was popular among the girls. After graduating from high school, Mike entered Florida State University, choosing the direction of real estate management. Studying was easy for him, and after classes he worked part-time in a real estate agency, gaining experience. Being a driven young man, he quickly realized that he wanted to build a successful career in this field. At university, Mike met Denise Morell, and their romance developed rapidly. She was a beautiful, well-groomed girl from a well-to-do family. Unlike Mike, who grew up in modest conditions, Denise is accustomed to comfort and wealth. She was attracted to Mike's confidence and efficiency. He was a man she could rely on, kind, considerate, and loyal. He surrounded Denise with care, fulfilled all her requests, dreamed of a happy family. In 1994, they got married. Their marriage seemed ideal. Two young, ambitious people built a successful life. Mike became one of the best real estate agents in Tallahassee, and Denise got a job in the banking sector. Soon, they had a daughter, and to those around them, they became the model family. But over time, cracks began to appear. Mike, despite his success, remained a simple man who liked hunting, nature, sitting with friends. Denise dreamed of a luxurious life, expensive restaurants, travel, status in society. She became more demanding, irritable, and their relationship became strained. Since his high school years, Mike had a best friend, Brian Winchester. They grew up together, studied, played sports, and later worked in the same business. Their friendship was a strong, time-tested one. Friends' wives also became friends. Kathy Winchester and Denise often spent time together, discussing family matters. The two families more than once went on vacation, celebrated holidays. At first glance, Brian was as loyal and reliable as Mike. They hunted together, discussed business, supported each other in difficult moments. 6 months before his disappearance, Mike took out a large accident insurance policy, almost $2 million. It was a substantial sum, but no one paid much attention to it at the time. Mike worked in a risky field, hunted, often went outdoors, and insurance seemed a logical step. However, one remarkable fact is that the insurance agent who drew up the documents was Brian Winchester. More importantly, Denise was the sole beneficiary of the policy. December 16, 2000 started out as a very ordinary day. Mike, as planned, got up early in the morning, put on his camouflage clothes, and prepared to hunt. Lake Seminole, where he went, was his favorite place. He had known those waters since he was a boy and had hunted there many times. Duck hunting was his tradition, and this time nothing boded ill. At about 5:30 a.m., he kissed his wife, quietly looked out into the nursery where his young daughter was sleeping, and left the house. Got in his truck and headed out to the lake. The weather that day was cool and the water was covered with a light mist. Mike arrived at the location, launched the boat, and set sail. He was never seen again after that. On that day, December 16, 2000, no one immediately suspected anything wrong. The duck hunt might have gone on long enough. Mike might have lingered on the water, deciding to enjoy the quiet of nature, but the longer he was gone, the more concern grew. Around lunchtime, Brian Winchester began to worry. He knew that Mike had gone to Lake Seminole and should have been home by now. Along with his father, he decided to drive to the hunting spot to make sure his friend was okay. When they arrived at the lake, they noticed Mike's car parked near the shore, a green Ford Bronco. The car was parked neatly, as if the owner had just stepped away for a while, but he himself was nowhere to be seen. Inside the car, everything looked familiar. No signs of struggle, nothing suspicious. One thing was alarming, however. There was no Mike's boat near the shore. Brian and his father began to look around the shore, shouting his name, but there was only silence. It became clear something had happened. Realizing that they would not be able to find out anything on their own, Brian contacted the authorities. First on the scene were staff from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Their experience with bodies of water gave them hope of finding the missing man quickly. The first search was organized. They used boats, explored the coast, tried to determine where Mike's boat could be. However, the search soon had to be interrupted. A strong storm began. The wind raised the waves, the water became murky, and the rain sharply reduced visibility. In such conditions, further investigation of the water body was impossible. The rescuers were forced to postpone the search until better weather conditions. When the weather improved, the search resumed with even greater scope. Divers scoured the bottom of the lake, hoping to find the body or at least some clues. Sonar boats were brought in and on-land patrols scoured the shoreline. However, the results were nil. Lake Seminole is a vast expanse of water full of underwater hiding places, snags, and submerged trees. Its murky waters prevented clear visibility, making it difficult for rescuers. However, despite their efforts, no body, no signs of struggle, and no personal belongings of Mike were found. Some began to question whether he had actually drowned. In similar cases, at least some remains had surfaced or washed ashore. However, a few days later, a search party found Mike's boat. It was drifting close to shore, virtually untouched. The discovery of the boat raised a new stream of questions. First, the boat had not been overturned. If Mike had actually encountered an underwater obstacle, his boat would probably have capsized, but it didn't. Secondly, a hunting rifle was found in the boat in a case. This fact indicated that Mike hadn't even started hunting. Any experienced hunter would have deployed the gun immediately after arriving at the site, because on Lake Seminole, ducks met at dawn, and it was the morning hours were considered the most successful for hunting. It all seemed strange. If Mike had drowned accidentally, his body should have surfaced within a few days. but it was nowhere to be found. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, after some time, investigators concluded that Mike Williams was most likely the victim of an accident. According to the official version, his boat hit an underwater stump hidden in the murky waters of Lake Seminole. As a result of the sharp impact, Mike lost his balance and fell overboard. Because he was wearing heavy boots and thick hunting clothes, his shoes quickly filled with water, weighing down his body and preventing him from climbing back into the boat. Unable to stay on the surface, Mike went underwater and soon drowned. The investigators could not be definitively sure of this because the body was never found. However, they hypothesized that Mike's remains could be prey to alligators inhabiting the lake. In their opinion, that is why, after months of searching, failed to find any bones or other traces of his death. This version was officially recognized as the main one, and the case gradually began to wind down. However, there were those who did not believe in this theory. The version that Mike Williams drowned and was eaten by alligators did not seem convincing to his mother, Cheryl Williams. She knew that in such cases, at least some remains are bound to remain: bones, fragments of clothing, objects that were with the person. But after weeks and months of searching, they found absolutely nothing. The more time passed, the more anxious Cheryl became. She realized that even in an environment like Lake Seminole, the body should have surfaced in a few days or at least been swept ashore by underwater currents. But the water seemed to swallow her son without a trace. In addition, experienced investigators began to wonder, if Mike really drowned, why was his boat left in perfect condition? If he had fallen overboard, the boat should have either capsized or at the very least gotten wet on the inside. However, there were no signs of struggle or emergency inside. It looked as if Mike hadn't even started hunting. But despite the mounting questions, there was no hard evidence for the investigation. The search, which had lasted weeks, had yielded not a single significant lead. With no body, no witnesses, no obvious signs of a crime, the authorities had no choice but to accept Mike's death as a tragic accident. Cheryl, however, didn't believe that. Something was wrong, and the more she thought about her son's disappearance, the more it seemed to her that the official explanation was not just wrong, but deliberately hiding the truth. Years passed, but the mystery of Mike Williams' disappearance remained unsolved. Then the investigation gained momentum, then again came to a standstill. In different years, from 2004 to 2011, investigators again and again turned to this case, but each time it was closed. The only person who didn't give up and kept demanding answers was his mother, Cheryl Williams. She did not believe in the official version and believed that her son was not eaten by alligators, and someone deliberately tried to hide the truth. Over the years, Cheryl wrote letters, met with detectives, and tried to get media attention. She believed that if she kept pushing the investigation, sooner or later the truth would come out. Cheryl became not only the voice of her son, but a real force that kept the case from fading into oblivion. After years of investigation, there are still new findings. During the next stage of the search, boots and a jacket belonging to Mike were found. The most important item was the jacket. In one of its pockets was a hunting license issued in Mike's name. This proved beyond a doubt that the items found belonged to him. But what alarmed the investigators the most was the condition of the clothes. The boots, jacket, and ID looked virtually untouched. They were not torn, tattered, or damaged, which strongly contradicted the alligator attack. If Mike's body had really fallen victim to wild animals, nothing would have been left of the clothes. The teeth and claws of alligators would have left obvious marks. However, this was not the case. This discovery was the first serious blow to the official version of his disappearance. In addition to Mike's mother, many acquaintances and family friends also doubted the official version of events. First, Mike did not like to hunt alone. Everyone who knew him said that he always called his friends to go duck hunting with him. For him, it was a tradition, hunting in the company, discussing plans, evenings sitting around the campfire. But that day, for some reason, he went alone. Secondly, Mike was an extremely cautious man. Everyone recalled that his water safety techniques were amazingly pedantic. He never sailed a boat with boots on. That was his ironclad rule. Every time he swam away from the shore, he took off his boots because he knew that if he accidentally went overboard, the heavy shoes could drag him to the bottom. But the official version said that it was the boots that prevented him from saving himself. This fact raised serious questions. How could a man who had been cautious all his life ignore his own rules that day? In addition, local experts questioned the main argument of the investigation, that Mike's body was allegedly completely destroyed by alligators. The fact is that December is the cold season in Florida, and alligators at this time are in a state of torpor. They do not attack and practically do not eat in winter as their metabolism slows down. Consequently, the version that predators attacked and completely destroyed the body looked extremely unlikely. All these facts only strengthened the suspicions. Against this background, the behavior of the two people who seemed to be most concerned about Mike's fate stood out. His wife Denise and best friend Brian Winchester did not show the slightest desire to pursue the investigation. They accepted the version of the accident unquestioningly. Moreover, after receiving nearly $2 million in insurance money, Denise quickly accepted the loss. It wasn't long before she was starting a new chapter of her life. And the best part is with whom. Denise married Brian Winchester, her late husband's best friend. This couldn't help but arouse suspicion from those around her. Too many things in this story looked strange and raised questions. Mike disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found despite a lengthy search. Usually, even if a person drowns, the water after some time brings out at least fragments of clothing or remains, but in this case there were absolutely no traces. The official version of the investigation, according to which he drowned and was eaten by alligators, looked less and less plausible because of the many inconsistencies. In addition, Denise acted as if her husband's death was not particularly shaken. She easily made an insurance payment and soon lived a new life as if nothing had happened. The most suspicious was the fact that sometime later, Denise married Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. Many saw a hidden meaning in this strange marriage, but the investigation still had no direct evidence to prove the crime. For Cheryl, this was the final proof that her son was the victim of a conspiracy. Without hard evidence, however, she could prove nothing. As the years passed, the truth remained deeply hidden. On August 6, 2016, an event occurred in the small town of Tallahassee that shocked the locals. At first glance, it was just a family affair, but in reality, it was the key to solving one of the most mysterious mysteries of the past 2 decades. That day, Brian Winchester kidnapped his wife, Denise. It would seem that the man who for years had remained on the sidelines in the case of the mysterious disappearance of Mike Williams had suddenly committed the crime himself. But in fact, that was only the beginning. It all started early in the morning when Denise Winchester left the house as usual and headed to her car to drive to work. She didn't even realize she was being watched. As soon as she opened the door and got into the passenger compartment, Brian suddenly appeared from behind her. He had hidden in the back seat beforehand and was patiently waiting for the moment to take her by surprise. He clutched a gun in his hand, and as soon as Denise was inside, he moved forward sharply, pointing the weapon threateningly in her face. His breathing was heavy, and his voice trailed off into a scream. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. To him, divorce meant the complete destruction of the life they'd been working toward for years. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a betrayal he couldn't accept. Brian was in a state of extreme nervousness. His hands were shaking, his emotions were overwhelming him, and at one point he even turned the gun on himself. It seemed to him that if he lost Denise, he would no longer have any meaning in his life. He had backed himself into a corner, seeing no other option but to force her to stay close by using fear and pressure. Denise realized that any careless word could have irreparable consequences. She tried to keep her cool despite the obvious threat. Gradually, she managed to convince Brian that they could talk things over and that they should not make any hasty decisions. She assured him that she would not go to the police and that they still had a chance to make things right. Those words had an effect on Brian. He began to calm down, his grip loosened, and after a few hours he finally decided to let her go. He was sure Denise would keep her word and not betray him. But once she was free, she didn't hesitate to go to the police and file a report. After Denise's statement, the police quickly found Brian. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping and threatening to kill. At the trial, he looked lost. He already knew he could not escape punishment. In December 2017, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It seemed like just a family drama that got out of hand. But in fact, it was the key to solving the most high-profile crime of recent years. Once behind bars, Brian Winchester remained silent for a long time. He hoped that he would be able to cope with the situation, but with each passing day, he realized, now he is completely out of control. His power over Denise was gone, she had betrayed him, and worst of all, he was all alone. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. The once carefully thought-out plan had crumbled, and there was no way out anymore. After much thought, Brian realized that the only thing he had left was the truth. He had nothing to lose, so he decided to speak up. In one of his interrogations, he made a shocking confession. Mike Williams was not killed in an accident, he was murdered. Brian told how it all happened, and this moment became a turning point in the case, which for many years remained unsolved. They'd been in love since high school, but they were both married. Divorce? That was unacceptable to Denise. In their circle, divorce was considered a disgrace. It would mean condemnation from family, church, society. Denise wanted them to be together, but she didn't want to ruin her image as the perfect wife and mother. Then they had another option. Brian confessed that they realized that if Mike was not alive, all the problems would disappear by themselves. Denise would get the insurance and no one would suspect a thing. They decided to kill Mike. The day Mike Williams was killed, Brian was waiting for him at Lake Seminole. When Mike arrived to hunt, Brian got into his boat. They got out on the water and Brian said they should check out one good place to hunt. When they got far enough out, he jumped on Mike and pushed him overboard. He was floundering in the water, trying to stay on the surface. That's when Brian pulled out his gun and shot him. Mike died instantly, and Brian moved his body to another spot and buried it. Then he returned to the lake to fake the accident. Where was the body? Brian told the investigators where they had hidden Mike's remains. The police immediately went to the location Winchester had given them. They found the body. It was buried deep underground. Despite the time, the remains were in good enough condition to be forensically examined. Investigators took DNA samples and compared them to Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. 18 years after Mike's disappearance, his body was finally found. It was now clear. He hadn't drowned, he'd been murdered. Denise's arrest. After these confessions, the investigation finally had the evidence that had been missing for so long. When questioned, she tried to defend herself. She said that Brian had threatened her, that he forced her into the conspiracy, that she didn't want to kill him. But the interrogators already knew the truth. They knew that Denise and Brian had been together for years. They knew that her marriage to Mike was a sham. And most importantly, they knew that Denise was the mastermind behind the murder. She didn't want to lose her reputation. She didn't want to suffer the shame of divorce. But she wanted to be with Brian and get the insurance money. Denise's choice was fatal. Now she had to answer for her actions in court. The arrest of Denise Williams became a real sensation. Almost 18 years after the disappearance of Mike Williams, the investigation finally had undeniable evidence of her involvement in the crime. Now she had to stand trial and answer for what she had done. The prosecution was based on the confession of Brian Winchester, who detailed the conspiracy, the murder, the staged accident, and the motive for the crime. In addition to his testimony, the investigation had physical evidence, including Mike's remains and proof of insurance fraud. The case garnered tremendous public outcry. Tallahassee citizens who had once sympathized with Denise were now horrified to realize that she had deliberately orchestrated her husband's murder for money and a life with Brian. The prosecutor's office brought 3 serious charges against Denise Williams. First, she was found to be the organizer of a conspiracy to murder Mike Williams. Second, she was charged with insurance fraud. Third, she was charged with aiding and abetting first-degree murder. Prosecutors said Denise was a key figure in the conspiracy. Not only was she involved in planning the murder, but she actively contributed to its cover-up, misleading everyone for years. Denise's attorneys built a defense on her allegedly passive role in the crime. They argued that she was the victim of manipulation by Brian, who forced her to participate by threatening her. In addition, the defense tried to refute accusations that Denise orchestrated the murder for insurance money, arguing that she never showed any particular interest in her husband's money. But those arguments were shattered in court. The prosecutor's office presented evidence of Denise and Brian's long-standing affair, proving that Mike's murder was a carefully planned move for the sake of their future together and financial gain. During the trial, the prosecution presented the testimony of Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. She described how she had fought for justice for years, how she had faced resistance from Denise, and how she had suspected her of lying all these years. Also presented in court were phone records of Denise and Brian, which showed that they had been in contact after Mike's disappearance, which confirmed their conspiracy. The main witness, Brian Winchester, detailed how they planned the murder, what they did afterward, and how Denise suggested waiting until Mike was officially declared dead to get insurance. His testimony was so exhaustive that Denise's defense could not refute it. On December 14, 2018, a Leon County jury found Denise Williams guilty of conspiracy to murder, insurance fraud, and aiding and abetting first-degree murder. On February 17, 2019, she was sentenced to life without parole for conspiracy to murder and accessory to murder, and an additional 30-year term for insurance fraud. In 2020, Denise Williams appealed, and the trial panel reversed her conviction. First, she avoided a conviction for fraud. To dismiss the charge, she turned over the entire amount of the insurance payout and the house to her daughter, thereby recouping the money she received and formally avoiding punishment for the financial crime. Second, the court dismissed the charge of accessory to murder because there was no direct evidence that she directly participated in or assisted in the crime. Despite Brian Winchester's admission that the murder was committed as part of their conspiracy, there was no legal basis at that time to consider Denise an actual accomplice to the murder, because she was not present at the crime scene. So, in 2020, the court vacated the fraud and accessory to murder charges and changed the sentence. The new sentence was 30 years imprisonment for conspiracy to murder. Kelly Steger was born on November 7, 1980, in Elmira, New York, to Jim and Linda Steger. She was the younger of two daughters, and from childhood was characterized by sociability and cheerful character. The girl grew up surrounded by love and care, and her parents always supported her endeavors. Learning was given to Kelly easily. At school, she was an active student, participated in a dance group, performed on stage, loved sports events. Her main passion was figure skating, which she practiced from early childhood. However, the professional career of a figure skater at her did not work out, and after graduating from high school, she went to college in her native state. Kelly had a striking appearance, blonde hair, wide smile, green eyes. Her friendliness attracted people, and she had many friends. After college, she took a job as a waitress at a local restaurant, where she was noticed by a man who would later change her life. Thomas Clayton was the complete opposite of Kelly. Confident, ambitious, and a risk-taker. Originally from Pennsylvania, he had a passion for hockey in his youth and dreamed of building a career as a professional athlete. His dream was partially realized. He managed to get into the youth team Elmira Jackals, which played in the lower leagues, and moved to Elmira. One evening, Thomas walked into the restaurant where Kelly worked. Their gazes met, and he immediately decided he had to meet her. Thomas was charismatic, knew how to impress, and literally charmed Kelly with his stories about hockey, travel, and dreams of the future. Their relationship developed quickly. Thomas left professional sports but stayed in Elmira, going into business. He opened a home restoration and renovation company. Thanks to his acumen and persistence, he managed to create a profitable business. 2 years after they met, Kelly and Thomas got married. It was a beautiful wedding full of laughter, dancing, and joy. Friends joked that they were the perfect couple. She, gentle and kind, he, purposeful and determined. After the wedding, the life of the young family seemed happy. Kelly took care of the house, and Thomas continued to develop his business. In 2008, they had a daughter, Charlie, and in 2012, a son, Callan. Kelly fully devoted herself to her children. She took them to circles, organized family picnics, photographed them every morning before school. Thomas, in turn, provided for the family and spent a lot of time at work. Their house was always full of guests. Kelly loved to host friends, cook treats, and threw parties. However, behind the external idol sometimes hid misunderstandings. Thomas had a temper. He couldn't stand it when things didn't go his way. He liked control, while Kelly, on the contrary, preferred flexibility. Sometimes fights broke out between them, sometimes over domestic trivialities, sometimes over more serious matters. But no one around them could have predicted that these small disagreements would one day lead to tragedy. September 29, 2015 began as a normal day in the Clayton household. Thomas had left on business in the morning and Kelly went about her usual chores. She dropped the kids off at school, then stopped by the supermarket, picking out groceries for the week, and met a friend for coffee. Autumn was her favorite time of year and they discussed plans for the coming weeks, talking about outings, holidays, family dinners. Kelly seemed relaxed, unsuspecting of anything. By evening, the house was filled with familiar sounds. Charlie was sitting in her room with her pencil sketchbook spread out in front of her, and Cullen was rolling small cars on the floor. Kelly was cooking dinner, checking to make sure the chicken breasts weren't burning in the oven. When the door opened and Thomas walked into the house, she immediately sensed something was wrong. He was later than usual and seemed tense, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Over dinner, they had a conversation that quickly turned into an argument. Kelly noticed that Thomas had been acting differently in recent weeks, often leaving in the evenings, talking on the phone for long periods of time and looking pensive. She asked if everything was okay, but he irritably threw in that he just had a lot of work to do. The argument didn't last long, but the tension hung over him afterward. Thomas quickly finished his meal, pushed his plate away, and rose from the table. Soon he began to get ready for a poker game with his friends. It was his usual Tuesday ritual. He lingered at the front door for a moment before heading out. Kelly looked at him with slight irritation, but still asked if he'd be back if he wasn't late. Thomas replied briefly that he would, as always. When the door slammed behind him, the house was once again filled with calm. Kelly cleared the table, checked to make sure the kids were tucked in, then turned on the television. She didn't realize it was her last night. Night was already falling as Thomas sat at the table in the house playing poker, spreading chips, dropping jokes, and trying to look relaxed. At one point he stood up, retreated to the next room, and approached one of the women present, saying his battery was dead. After getting his phone, he went outside, dialed a number, and listened to the ringing tone for a few seconds. The conversation lasted only a couple minutes. After that, he went back to the table, threw a couple of phrases, made another bet, and spent another hour and a half playing. As the clock approached midnight, Thomas said goodbye to his friends, got into his car, and drove home. The yard was dark, but there were lights on in the house. He pushed open the door, walked in, and called out to his wife. There was no response. His heart suddenly beat faster. Thomas took a few steps toward the bedroom, pushed open the door, and froze. On the floor next to the bed lay Kelly. She hadn't moved. It was as if everything around her had shrunk in an instant. Thomas rushed to the phone, dialed 911, and typing confusedly, squeezed the words into the receiver that his wife was dead. That night, everything changed forever in the Clayton home. When the first police cars pulled up in front of the Claytons' home on Gorman Road in the small town of Cayton, New York, the street was plunged into silence. Only the faint flickering of street lights at neighboring houses and the rare cries of nightbirds could be heard in the darkness. Thomas Clayton met the police right on the porch. His face was pale, his movements sharp and nervous. He quickly escorted the officers inside, showing them the way to the bedroom. The first thing that caught the detective's eye was the clutter. The room smelled acridly of blood, with dark stains everywhere. Near the bed, on the floor, Kelly Clayton's body lay in an unnatural pose. Her face and arms showed signs of a struggle, numerous bruises. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were torn. Detectives immediately realized the woman had tried to defend herself, but her opponent was too strong. The room looked as if something swift and violent had happened here. There were broken pillows on the floor and a broken lamp next to the bed. An unfinished glass of water lay in the corner. In the closet, clothes were slightly displaced, but didn't look like someone was looking for something valuable. The paintings hung evenly on the walls, the victim's purse and jewelry left in its place. It was immediately clear that this was not a robbery. There were no signs of forced entry in the house. The locks on the doors were intact. The windows were closed. All indications were that the assailant had either entered the house without resistance or had the keys. While one group of officers surveyed the scene, others began interviewing Thomas. He was shaken, his voice shaking as he explained that he had come home from a poker game and found his wife dead. He claimed he heard nothing and suspected nothing until he entered the bedroom. While the investigation was underway, one of the officers noticed movement in the hallway. From around the corner, peering out fearfully, stood a little girl. 7-year-old Charlie Clayton. She was wearing a nightgown, her hair disheveled, her eyes frightened. Her quiet voice echoed through the silence, asking where her mom was. The detectives looked around. They hadn't expected to find a child in the house. The officer squatted down gingerly, held out his hand to her, and asked if she had been home all evening. The girl nodded but said nothing more. The police officers took her into another room to talk later, when she felt safer. At this point, no one knew yet that Charlie would become a key witness in the case. As the medical examiners began examining the body, investigators were trying to figure out who might have been interested in killing Kelly Clayton. The first thought that came to mind was a random assault or robbery, but the lack of signs of forced entry said otherwise. The killer either knew the victim or somehow got into the house undetected. The next version, a crime motivated by jealousy or family conflict. In many such cases, it's the spouse who becomes the prime suspect. However, Thomas had an alibi. He was at a friend's poker game, and this could confirm several people. Nevertheless, the police did not exclude the possibility that the killer could be related to someone from their social circle. Detectives began with the first interviews. Police interviewed the nearest neighbors to see if anyone had heard screams or seen anything suspicious. One elderly woman who lived across the street said she heard muffled voices around 11 p.m. but didn't pay much attention. No one else noticed anything suspicious. Detectives contacted Kelly's immediate family. Her sister Kim Bourgeois was shocked by what happened. She said Kelly never complained about threats or problems. Kelly's friends said she was a cheerful and kind person, always supportive of those around her. However, one friend admitted that Kelly seemed tense in recent months, but never said why. Police also questioned Thomas's co-workers at his business. They characterized him as a demanding but fair manager. One employee mentioned that Thomas had been irritable and tense lately, but all believed it was work. Forensic investigators began analyzing the evidence at the crime scene. The first thing they were interested in was the nature of Kelly's wounds. It appeared that the killer had used a blunt, heavy object, but no crime weapon was found in the house. A search of the house also turned up a few odd details. There were subtle dirt marks on the stairs, as if someone had entered the house from the street. The carpet in the hallway had a mark on it that looked like a man's boot print. While exploring the kitchen, detectives found Kelly's cell phone. The last call she took was at 9:47 p.m., but no one called from her number after that. In the bathroom, police noticed wet towels, although no one in the house had showered that evening. This got them thinking perhaps the killer was washing his hands or trying to wash away traces of blood. Despite the abundance of small details, the investigation did not yet have a complete picture. The motive for the crime remained unclear, and the police did not yet have a prime suspect. But soon detectives remembered a little girl found in the house. Perhaps she had seen or heard something important. So far, investigators had no idea how valuable her words would be. Police continued to scrutinize the crime scene. The house was cordoned off and investigators scoured the yard and surrounding areas for possible evidence. The main focus was on the backyard, where the dirt had been lightly loosened and the grass had been crumpled in several places, as if someone had walked through there a short time before. The officers scoured the neighborhood with flashlights, looking out for every suspicious object. Soon, one of them spotted an object in the grass near the house that at first glance might have seemed unremarkable. It was the keys to the house. They were lying on the ground a few feet from the back door. The police carefully packed the find and sent it for examination. However, the most important discovery awaited the investigators next. While searching not far from the house in a small creek that ran through the wooded area, detectives found a heavy metal object, a broken hammer, or rather the handle of a sledgehammer, which still had traces of caked blood on it. Other things were also found next to it, pieces of cloth with dark stains that resembled blood. All of this was immediately sent for analysis to establish. Investigators realized that the evidence could provide clues to solving the crime, but it would take time. While the tests were underway, police decided to focus on the only witness who was in the house at the time of the murder. 7-year-old Charlie Clayton. Working with a child required a special approach. Charlie had experienced tremendous stress, and the investigators realized that the usual interrogations will not help here. So they turned to the Child Protection Center of Chemung County, where specialists in child psychology worked. One of these specialists was Detective Don Lewis, who specialized in talking to child witnesses of crimes. His main goal was to build rapport with Charlie so that she could talk about what happened that night without feeling afraid or pressured. Lewis spent several hours with the girl, talking to her in a warm, relaxed environment. The conversation began with simple questions about school, about friends, about her favorite activities. Gradually, he brought her up to the events of that night. When he asked what had happened in the house, Charlie froze, lowered her head, and said quietly that she had been awakened in the night by a noise. She walked out of the room and saw the stranger standing over her mom. Charlie, clenching her small hands into fists, said quietly that her mom had yelled for her to run. Lewis cautiously asked what the attacker looked like. The girl hesitated, then whispered that he was wearing a mask. She couldn't see his face, only eyes that looked like her daddy's. The investigator tensed slightly, but didn't show it. He continued asking questions, gently leading Charlie to a more detailed description. The girl said that the man was dressed in black, that he moved quickly, and that his voice sounded like her dad's. Lewis understood that children in these situations can attribute familiar images to strangers. To Charlie, her father was the most important man in her life, and if she saw something vaguely familiar, her childlike imagination could paint a familiar image. Lewis asked softly if she was sure it was her father. Charlie frowned, hesitated, and whispered quietly, "I don't know." The police could not ignore this fact. Although the child's testimony could not be considered 100% proof, it was serious evidence. Thomas Clayton was now becoming part of the investigation, not only as a husband who had lost his wife, but also as a possible suspect. Several hours after speaking with Charlie, the detectives returned to the Clayton home, where Thomas was waiting for them. He looked exhausted, and his movements were jittery. When the officers told him he was in custody, Thomas didn't react at first, as if he didn't understand the meaning of what was being said. Then he shook his head slowly and repeated quietly, "No, you can't seriously." He was informed that for the moment he was being held for further proceedings. This did not mean a charge, but he was to spend the night at the station. Thomas Clayton did not resist. He only repeated several times that he loved his wife, that he would never hurt her. But the police had to check everything. The problem was that Thomas had an alibi. He had spent the entire evening playing poker, and his friends confirmed this. However, the investigators still had doubts. Soon, new information came to light. When detectives started checking his alibi again, they questioned everyone who was with him that evening. Thomas's friends confirmed that he was with them, that he was playing and behaving as usual. But one of the women present at the game remembered an important detail. She said that at one point Thomas approached her and asked for her cell phone. Thomas approached the woman and, smiling, asked for the phone, explaining that his battery was dead and he needed to make an urgent call. The woman handed him the phone without giving it much thought. The conversation lasted only a couple minutes, after which Thomas returned to the game. But now investigators have a new question. Who did he call that night? It could have been an ordinary conversation, but if it was a call related to the murder, it could be a key piece of evidence. The police had requested call data from the woman's cell phone, and now all that was left to do was wait for the information. What if this call connected Thomas to whoever was in the house at the time of the murder? Investigators couldn't say for sure yet, but one thing was certain: the investigation was just beginning to gain momentum. Investigators scrutinized the call detail from the phone of a woman whose cell phone Thomas Clayton had borrowed during a poker game. A call made an hour and a half before Kelly's body was found led them to one name: Michael Beard. The name turned out to be familiar. Michael was a former employee of Thomas Construction Company who had been fired shortly before the murder. Whether or not that was a coincidence remained to be seen. The police quickly located him and went to his home. When two officers knocked on the door, a tall, stout man appeared a few seconds later, looking sleepy but quickly assessing the situation. One of the officers introduced himself and indicated that they needed to talk. Michael's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes. He nodded briefly, silently took his jacket, and followed the officers. At the same moment, the forensic team was finishing analyzing the evidence they had found. DNA forensics confirmed that the blood traces on the metal axe belonged to Kelly Clayton. That's the murder weapon. In addition, fingerprints were found on the handle, and they belonged to a man. When forensics obtained Thomas Clayton's and Michael Beard's prints, the comparison with those found on the weapon was unequivocal. Michael Beard had used the weapon. Investigators now knew he was in the house that night. But who gave him access? Why was he there? Whose initiative was it? Only interrogations could provide the answers. When Michael was led into the police station, he looked collected but tense. The investigator opened a folder with documents and, without changing his tone, asked if he knew Thomas Clayton. Michael replied that yes, he had worked for him. The detective continued by asking if they had been socializing the night of the murder. Beard nodded, confirming that Thomas had indeed called him. What was the conversation about? About work, he replied, nothing out of the ordinary. Then the investigator laid before him a photograph of the murder weapon, turned over the forensic report, and calmly informed him that the handle of the sledgehammer bore his fingerprints. Michael pressed his lips together at first, then slowly shook his head and said it was impossible. The investigator, without changing his even tone, explained that it was not conjecture, but scientific fact, and offered to give an explanation. There was silence for a few seconds, then Beard exhaled heavily and said that Thomas Clayton had hired him. He had offered $10,000 for the murder of his wife. The investigator leaned forward slightly and clarified if he agreed right away. Michael thought for a moment and said that he had refused at first, but then, when Thomas came out with the offer again, he had agreed after all. The detective nodded, making notes. A few days later, however, realizing that his confession threatened a life sentence, Beard decided to change his testimony. When questioned again, he said that Thomas had indeed hired him, but not to kill him, but to set the house on fire. He went to the address, he said, but when he went inside, he found Kelly already dead. He did not kill her, he claimed, but merely saw the aftermath. The investigator listened silently and calmly laid out the photos in front of Michael. The sledgehammer used to strike her, his prints on the handle. If he hadn't killed anyone, why were his marks on the weapon? Beard remained silent. The police now had the full picture. Thomas Clayton had ordered the murder of his wife, and Michael Beard had been the executor. When he was formally charged, he was arrested and sent to a detention center. Now investigators had to focus on the second participant in the crime, the man who had conceived the plan. Thomas Clayton continued to insist that he was innocent, but his connection to Beard, his call at the right moment, and the hard evidence told a different story. The only question was how he would behave when he was put on trial. When the investigation was completed and the prosecution had gathered enough evidence, the case went to trial. The murder of a young mother, orchestrated by her own husband, shocked the city and caused a wide public outcry. On the days of the hearing, the courthouse was filled with journalists, relatives of the victim, and residents who had been following the case from the beginning. People wanted to hear the truth and see justice served. In the center of attention were two main figures: Thomas Clayton, who was recently a respected businessman and family man, and Michael Beard, accused of carrying out a contract killing. The trial began with the presentation of evidence. Prosecutor Wyden Wetmore built the prosecution case around a few key aspects: Thomas's financial motive, incontrovertible evidence from the crime scene, and Michael Beard's confession. The first and most compelling piece of evidence was the call Thomas Clayton made to Bird an hour and a half before he returned home and discovered his wife's body. This call was proven to have been made from someone else's cell phone, indicating that Thomas was attempting to avoid direct communication between himself and the perpetrator. Next, the prosecutor presented physical evidence, which included a sledgehammer found near the house with traces of Kelly Clayton's blood. The forensic examination proved that it was the murder weapon, and fingerprint analysis confirmed that it was used by Michael Beard. This was a decisive moment for the court. The evidence found at the crime scene directly linked Bird to the brutal massacre. One of the most emotional moments of the trial was the reading of the words of 7-year-old Charlie Clayton. The girl herself was not brought into the courtroom to protect her from psychological trauma, but her testimony was read in the presence of the jury. She told how she saw her attacker and how her mother screamed at her to run. Of particular note was her statement that the killer's eyes reminded her of her father's eyes. The court took into account that the child may have unconsciously matched the stranger to a family member, but this moment was still another link in the chain of evidence against Thomas. Bank transfers that Clayton had made shortly before the murder were also presented in court. These financial transactions proved that he was raising money to pay off the perpetrator. The prosecutor noted that Thomas was in a difficult financial situation and Kelly controlled the family finances. According to the prosecution's version, he didn't want to divide assets in the divorce and may have wanted the insurance money after her death. The prosecutor's office also invited witnesses from Kelly's inner circle. Her friends and family said that in the months before the tragedy she began to change. Previously cheerful and upbeat, she became increasingly tense, though she wouldn't tell anyone directly what was wrong. Some friends recalled that she hinted at problems in her marriage, but tried not to publicize it. Thomas Clayton's defense tried to dispute the allegations. The lawyers argued that Charlie's words could not be considered 100% proof, as the child could have confused the images or misinterpreted the situation. They also insisted that the phone call does not prove collusion because its content remains unknown. In their version, Thomas had no motive for the murder, and his presence at the poker game provided him with an alibi. However, the main blow to the defense hit the results of expertise: Michael Beard's fingerprints on the murder weapon and his own confessions. In the first interrogations, he directly stated that Thomas Clayton hired him to kill his wife. Later, he tried to change his testimony, saying that his job was only to set the house on fire and that he had not committed the murder, but the evidence said otherwise. If he really only intended to set the house on fire, why were his fingerprints on the handle of the sledgehammer? The jury listened carefully to all the arguments of the parties. The trial lasted several weeks, during which time all the details of the crime were sorted out. As a result, the prosecution was able to build a coherent and logically sound version of events, supported by both physical evidence and witness testimony. Before the sentencing, Kim Bourgeois, Kelly's sister, read a letter written by Charlie. The girl wrote that she loved her parents but now realizes that her father was a coward because he could not kill her mother himself but made another man do it. These words sounded in the courtroom as a final blow to Thomas Clayton. The prosecutor's office demanded the maximum penalty for both defendants, emphasizing that it was a cold-blooded crime committed out of self-interest. The public demanded justice, and when the judge announced that the sentence would be handed down shortly, the room froze in tense anticipation. On February 24, 2070, the Steuben County Court found Thomas Clayton guilty of orchestrated murder and second-degree murder. On April 27, 2070, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On November 16, 2016, the court found Michael Beard guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On February 28, 2070, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Paige Bergfeld was born on April 27, 1973, in Denver, Colorado, to Frank and Suzanne Bergfeld. She was the eldest daughter in the family, and from childhood was characterized by vividness of mind, energy, and determination. Her parents raised her in the spirit of independence and hard work. From a young age, Paige was unusually active. She participated in school plays, played sports, and was fond of music. In high school, her friends and teachers described her as friendly, cheerful, and incredibly charismatic. Paige was successful in school. She was attracted to entrepreneurship and business, and as a teenager, she showed commercial acumen. Her parents recalled that while she was still in school, she organized mini-businesses, selling handmade jewelry, making small souvenirs, and reselling school supplies to her classmates. After high school, she attended the University of Miami, Ohio, where she studied business and marketing. Her desire for independence manifested itself during her college years. She studied and worked part-time at the same time, not wanting to depend on her parents. During this time, she met Ron Bagler, a young man who was older than her and worked in finance. Their romance developed quickly, and soon Paige accepted a marriage proposal. In 1995, Paige married Ron Bagler, but their marriage did not last long. The young couple faced different views on the future. Paige dreamed of a family and children, and Ron did not want to have children. The differences became more and more apparent, and in 1997 they divorced. Despite the separation, they maintained their friendship, and years later they became close again, but as friends. After the divorce, Paige did not give up. She continued to build her career, opened several businesses. She sold baby carriers for babies, taught dancing for babies, and organized classes for parents. She dreamed of creating a successful business that would secure her future. In the late 1990s, she met Rob Dixon, a charming and successful businessman with whom she began a serious relationship. They married in 1998 and soon had 3 children. At first, everything seemed perfect. A large house, financial stability, a prosperous family. But soon in their relationship began to appear problems. Rob was losing business, experiencing financial difficulties, and with it became irritable and aggressive. In 2005, Paige sued her husband, accusing him of domestic violence. According to her, he threatened to kill their children if she left him. After a difficult divorce in 2006, Paige was left alone with 3 children and huge debts. Her lifestyle changed completely. She was now the sole breadwinner for the family. She continued to run her business, but money was tight. After her divorce from Rob Dixon, Paige found herself in a difficult situation. She was left alone with 3 children, forced to independently provide for the family. A large house, which once seemed a cozy nest, now became an impossible financial burden. But Paige never complained. She looked for ways out, tried to earn money in different ways. Her entrepreneurial spirit kept her going. She continued to sell baby carriers, taught dance classes for babies, and looked for new ideas. She worked long hours a day, sparing no effort to make sure her children never lacked anything. Despite her busy schedule, she always made time for her family. She helped with homework, organized trips to the park, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. In the eyes of others, she remained a strong, independent woman who managed to combine everything: work, motherhood, personal life. No one could not think that there was something in her life about which she preferred to keep silent. June 28, 2007, a Thursday, started out normally for Paige. In the morning, she woke up the kids, got them ready for school, and then took care of business. That afternoon, she had to drive to the neighboring town of Eagle to meet Ron Bagler, her first husband. They agreed to see each other in the afternoon, spent time together, talked, and then Paige drove back to Grand Junction. On the way home, she called Ron to make sure he'd gotten there safely, then continued on her way. Work awaited her in the evening. The kids were staying with the babysitter, and she had to meet with a client. On the way back, she talked on the phone, clarified matters, and made plans for the evening. Later, her phone activity stopped abruptly. Her children and nanny were waiting for her at home. According to people close to her, she always returned on time. If she was late, she gave notice. But that night, Paige never returned. The next morning, her friend Barbara Campbell began to worry. Paige had always kept her word, and now she wasn't answering her cell phone. Paige's children began to panic. Her 8-year-old daughter Jess left several anxious voicemails begging her mom to come back. 2 days passed, but Paige never showed up. On June 30, her father, Frank Bergfield, received a call from the police. His daughter had been officially reported missing. He knew immediately something terrible had happened. When the police officially declared Paige Bergfield missing, her family sprang into action immediately. Her father, Frank Bergfield, who lived in Denver, immediately dropped everything and traveled to Grand Junction. He realized that his daughter would never leave his children without an explanation, and he had no doubt something serious had happened. The missing persons report shocked her brother Craig too. When he heard the call from his father, he felt his voice shake with tears for the first time in years. It wasn't just a wake-up call for the family. It was a disaster. Paige's children, especially her 8-year-old daughter Jess, were in a state of confusion and panic. She tried to call her mother, leaving voice messages begging her to come home. The house filled with anxiety with each passing hour, and still no word from Paige. It had been 2 days since she had last been in touch, but no friends, family, or co-workers had been able to contact her. It was then that the nanny who was staying with the children made the decision to contact the police. She took Jess with her and went to the station to report Paige's disappearance. When the girl stood in front of the officers, she could barely hold back her tears. She kept repeating the same thing. Her mom always keeps her promises, and if she said she was coming home, then that was the way it was supposed to be. This statement finally convinced the police that the situation could not be left unattended. After receiving the official report of the disappearance, the police immediately began their investigation. The first thing investigators began to do was to gather information about Paige's life, her daily routes and habits. In the first stages, 3 possible versions of her disappearance were considered. The first hypothesis was a voluntary disappearance, but according to relatives, this option was absolutely excluded. Paige would never leave her children and would not break all contact without explanation. The second version was an accident. There was a possibility that she had been in an accident or had been attacked. However, the absence of signals from her phone and credit card suggested that if the accident had happened, it was not accidental. The last hypothesis, the most disturbing, suggested a crime. But so far, police had no concrete evidence pointing to violent behavior. Police's first steps were to look around Paige's home and talk to her loved ones. Detectives hoped to find some clues, but all indications were that the woman had no intention of leaving for long. Her belongings were still in their places. There were no signs of a struggle in the house, and no documents or personal items had been touched. On the 3rd day after the missing person was reported, there was an unexpected turn in the investigation. A few kilometers outside of town, a car was found completely engulfed in flames. When the police arrived on the scene, it was clear it was a red Ford Focus belonging to Paige. From the first minutes, detectives realized that the fire was arson. The car was in a remote location, away from other vehicles or buildings, eliminating the possibility of accidental ignition. Experts immediately concluded that the fire was used to destroy possible evidence. After a thorough examination of the burned vehicle, forensic experts concluded that the hearth of the fire was located in the driver's seat area. This indicated that the perpetrator had purposefully destroyed the part of the car where fingerprints or other traces could have been left. The strangest thing, however, was the position of the front seat. It had been pushed back so far that a man of Paige's stature would not have been physically able to drive the car. That meant that someone much taller than her had been driving the last time. That fact could help give us an idea of the possible culprit. Although most of the items inside the car were destroyed by the fire, one item survived. Paige's day planner was found in the car, but its pages were torn out. What alarmed investigators the most was the exact dates that had been removed. Missing were entries for June 26, 27, 28, and 29, the exact days Paige disappeared. It looked as if someone was trying to hide information about her meetings or contacts during that period. Police realized this was no accident. Someone had deliberately deleted the pages, wanting to erase important information. However, it was not yet clear who did this and what information they were trying to hide. After the discovery of the burned-out car, the case of Paige's disappearance officially became a criminal investigation. While there had previously been hope that she might have simply left for personal reasons, it was now clear that her disappearance was connected to a crime. But despite all the findings, the police still had no suspects. The only thing they realized for sure was that Paige Bergfeld wasn't just missing, she was the victim of someone else's carefully planned crime. After it became clear that Paige Bergfeld was not just missing, but could have been the victim of a crime, police launched a massive search. The Mesa County area was huge, about 3,300 square miles, and investigators had to cover vast stretches of desert and inaccessible terrain. The operation was supported by volunteers, family members, and friends of Paige, who wanted to do everything they could to find her. Her brother Craig Bergfeld temporarily left his life in Seattle to join the search. He and his father drove around the neighborhood, hoping to find at least some clue that might answer the question of what happened to his sister. Meanwhile, the police began to investigate possible motives for the crime. Paige's ex-husbands were the first to come under suspicion. The first person detectives looked at was her second husband, Rob Dixon. Their marriage lasted from 1998 to 2026, and during that time there were many conflicts and crises in their relationship. When Dixon lost his business and faced financial problems, his character changed. He became irritable, irascible, and unpredictable. It was during this period that the first serious conflicts in their family appeared, which eventually led to divorce. During Dixon's background investigation, police found a recording of a 911 call Paige made in 2004. On that day, she told the dispatcher that her husband had threatened her with terrible violence. He was supposed to watch the children while she was at work, she said, but became angry and told her that when she returned she would find them dead. Despite the severity of the allegation, the police did not charge him at the time, but that fact now mattered. The following year, in 2005, the situation repeated itself, and Paige went to the police again, but now with a complaint of battery. Dixon was then charged with third-degree assault, but after a hearing, he was able to negotiate a plea deal on a less serious charge of domestic harassment. He was eventually given a suspended sentence, and the incident was soon hushed up. But that event was the last straw. A year later, they divorced. Paige's financial situation at that time was also difficult. After the divorce, she was left with debts, a large house, and 3 children in her care. Her mortgage costs exceeded $6,000 a month, and her income, despite several sources of income, was unstable. All these facts led police to scrutinize Dixon, but he was soon ruled out as a suspect. At the time of Paige's disappearance, he was in Philadelphia, and cell tower data confirmed that his phone had not left the city. Moreover, upon learning of his ex-wife's disappearance, he immediately traveled to Colorado and offered his assistance to the investigation. The next person to whom detectives turned their attention was Paige's first husband, Ron Bagler. They were married for only 2 years, from 1995 to 1997, and the reason for their separation was disagreement over children. Paige dreamed of having a family, and Bagler was not ready for fatherhood. Despite the divorce, they maintained their friendship and even started socializing again after her breakup with Dixon. He last saw her on June 28, 2007, the same day she disappeared. They agreed to meet in the small town of Eagle, which was between their places of residence. They spent a few hours together that day, and when they parted ways, Paige called him to make sure he got home safely. That was the last time anyone spoke to her. Bagler called the police himself when he learned Paige was missing. He informed investigators that she couldn't have just left the house without an explanation. Cell phone data confirmed what he said. He was indeed in Denver, hours away from Grand Junction, when Paige disappeared. Police have since ruled him out as a suspect. A few days later, as police continued their search, a random driver with a flat tire found a checkbook on the ground on the side of the road leading from Grand Junction to the southeast. When it was turned over to police, it turned out to belong to Paige Bergfeld. Soon other items were found nearby: insurance cards, driver's licenses, bank cards. They were scattered along the road in small groups, as if someone had deliberately left a trail. Police speculated that perhaps Page herself, already in danger, may have been trying to signal her movement. These findings led investigators to look even more closely at her recent movements and contacts. That's when they discovered her secret cell phone, which she used to lead a second, hidden life. Police determined that Page worked as an escort. Under the alias Carrie, she ran an agency called Models, Inc., offering massage and escort services to clients. For a long time, none of her family or friends knew about the business. In the late 1990s, she danced at a strip club in Denver and later organized her own agency network. A review of her financial transactions and phone records revealed that her escort work helped her cope financially, but also put her at serious risk. Her clients included a variety of men, but not all of them behaved appropriately. After this discovery, the circle of suspects widened. The police began to cross-check all the clients who had contacted Page shortly before her disappearance. There were several people on the list, but one in particular caught their attention. It was Lester Ralph Jones, a man who had previously been in trouble with the law for sexual assault and kidnapping. His name appeared in Page's phone records the day before she disappeared. He called her several times trying to set up a meeting. Up until that point, the investigation had been wandering in the dark, but now they had a viable suspect. After carefully analyzing the phone records, investigators were able to weed out all possible suspects except for one man, Lester Ralph Jones. This 55-year-old mechanic worked at Bob Scott RV's workshop in Grand Junction. He was one of the people who tried to arrange a meeting with Page the day before she disappeared. Investigators learned that Page was already acquainted with Jones. Their first meeting took place as part of her job as an escort, but the woman experienced negative emotions after interacting with this client. She even avoided further contact with him, passing on his requests to coworkers. On the day Jones again sought a meeting with her, Page offered to send Carol Linder home instead, a woman who sometimes performed massage services for her agency. Linderholm later recalled that she felt uncomfortable the moment she crossed the threshold of Jones's home. The man made a repulsive impression on her. Tall and massive, he made it clear that he expected more than just a massage. Linderholm refused to meet his demands but still gave him a short treatment, being careful not to engage in conflict. Afterward, she left with an uneasy feeling of foreboding. Detectives investigated Jones' possible connection to Page's disappearance, but they needed more evidence. Then they discovered an important nuance. His workplace at Bob Scott RVs was literally across the street from where Page's burned-out car was found. This coincidence looked too suspicious. In addition, another interesting detail surfaced. Recalling the examination of the car, the detectives noticed that the driver's seat had been pushed backwards. This indicated that the last person to sit behind the wheel was a tall man. Lester Jones fit that description. When the police first contacted Lester Jones, he did not avoid contact. On July 5, 2007, detectives came to his office, and he agreed to voluntarily talk to them. The interview lasted 2.5 hours, during which time Jones was calm and confident. He denied any involvement in Page's disappearance and stated that he did not know what had happened to her. He also provided his fingerprints, DNA samples, and gave the police the keys to his white Dodge pickup. So far, there was nothing suspicious in his behavior, but investigators did not believe him. Before Page Bergfeld disappeared, her work phone received numerous calls. Police discovered that one caller was calling from a track phone burner phone, an inexpensive cell phone that can be used anonymously. That phone was activated the day before Page disappeared. It was used only 5 times and then stopped ringing altogether. Jones vehemently denied ever having one. However, during a search of his home and workplace, police found an empty track phone box that had been thrown in the trash. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation. Detectives went to the local Walmart where the phone was purchased and requested surveillance footage. What they saw left no doubt. On the screen was Lester Jones, wearing the same clothes in which he came to the first interview with the police. The investigation now had the irrefutable fact that Jones was lying. After obtaining the videos, police conducted a more thorough search of both Jones' home and his workplace. As a result, investigators found several disturbing items. Among them were a woman's bra that did not belong to his wife, several men's wigs, and a gasoline canister. The items discovered raised many questions. Given that Page's car had been deliberately burned, the presence of the gas can was highly suspicious. In addition, among the items found were a Viagra packet and a supply of condoms, possibly indicating his intentions on the day of Page's disappearance. Despite numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence, the police could not press charges. The main problem was the lack of a body. Until Paige Bergfeld's body was found, the charges against Lester Jones remained only speculation. Investigators felt he was guilty, but they lacked the final piece of evidence that could put the case to rest. The case froze in suspense. Jones remained at large, and Paige was officially missing. The fateful discovery 5 years later. In March 2012, 5 long years after Page's disappearance, a random hiker walking along the highway discovered human remains. They were in a dried-up riverbed among rocks, dry bushes, and branches. After examining the site, experts immediately realized that the remains belonged to a woman. For the final identification was carried out comparison with dental records and then DNA analysis. The results confirmed the scary part. It was Paige Bergfeld. The remains showed that she had been bound and duct-taped, indicating that she had been forcibly restrained. The police now had all the evidence they needed to apprehend Lester Jones. In November 2014, more than 7 years after Page's disappearance, Mesa County Police arrested Lester Jones. He was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. After years of uncertainty, the investigation was finally nearing its climax. But there was a trial ahead where the prosecution had to prove Jones' guilt, despite the lack of direct physical evidence. The Lester Jones trial began in July 2016, 9 years after Paige Bergfeld disappeared. Prosecutors presented a detailed picture of what they believe happened the night she disappeared. The main motive for the murder that the prosecution voiced was that Jones was a violent man with a history of violence against women. He had a history of trouble with the law for kidnapping and assault, and may have killed Paige when he realized he could not meet her again after their first encounter. During the trial, Jess Dixon, Paige's 17-year-old daughter, took the stand and recounted how her mother disappeared when she was just 8 years old. She recalled the desperation and fear she felt in the days when she tried to reach her mother by leaving voice messages. Also testifying at the trial was Frank Bergfeld, Paige's father, who gave an emotional account of what a wonderful mother and woman his daughter was. He talked about how her life was filled with caring for her children and work, and that she would never have left her family voluntarily. A significant moment in the trial was the testimony of Lisa Nance, the ex-wife of Lester Jones. She recounted that in the late 1990s he kidnapped her at gunpoint and threatened to kill her. When she began dating another man, Jones stalked them, shot the rival, and then tried to subjugate her to his will again. A month after this incident, he broke into her home and forcibly took her away in a car, threatening to drown her in a lake where no one would find her. Nance's recollections showed that Jones was capable of violence, especially when he felt he was losing control over women. Lester Jones himself refused to testify in court. However, prosecutors presented an audio recording of a conversation he had with police shortly after his initial interview. During the call, the officer informed him that police had completed their search of his vehicles and he could pick them up. Jones abruptly replied that he was not going to do so. When the officer expressed bewilderment, Jones uttered the phrase, "Are you asking me where I might bury the body?" This statement, made 5 years before Paige's remains were found, shocked investigators. It sounded as if he had confessed to the crime himself. A few days after the call, Jones attempted suicide by taking sleeping pills. Before doing so, he wrote a note in which he claimed he was innocent but could no longer tolerate the police harassment. The trial lasted 22 days, after which the jury was unable to reach a consensus. This led to the trial being declared a mistrial and a new trial being ordered. The prosecutors immediately decided that they would seek a retrial because the evidence was very compelling, but too long and difficult for the jury to hear. The second trial began on November 21, 2016, just 10 weeks after the first. This time, prosecutors emphasized key points to avoid overloading the evidence. Among the new facts presented to the court was a surveillance video outside Page's office that shows a white Chevrolet Impala driving slowly around her car. The police discovered that this car belonged to Lester Jones' wife, and she was away at the time of Page's disappearance. This discovery confirmed that in the days before her disappearance, Jones had been following Page. 4 days of deliberations later, the jury reached its final verdict. On December 23, 2016, a Mesa County court found Lester Ralph Jones guilty of the following crimes: first-degree murder, felony murder, murder during the commission of another crime, second-degree murder, and kidnapping. On January 30, 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole.